True Scary and Horror Story Number 1. The Last Phone Call. Chapter 1. The Call. Sarah Bennett leaned back in her worn-out office chair, the hum of her laptop filling the room as she finished editing an article. The room was dimly lit, her desk lamp casting long shadows across piles of papers and coffee-stained notebooks. She was used to late nights like this, working alone, her thoughts occasionally drifting to her younger sister, Lily. They hadn't spoken in a few days, which wasn't unusual. Lily was always restless, constantly traveling to remote places in search of inspiration for her photography portfolio. At 12:37 a.m., her phone buzzed. The sharp sound startled her, breaking the silence. She glanced at the screen. It was Lily. A small smile tugged at Sarah's lips, probably another one of her late-night updates about some breathtaking landscape or quirky local tale. "Hey, Lil," Sarah started, but her voice faltered. On the other end of the line, Lily was whispering, her tone urgent and trembling. "Sarah." "I need you," Lily said, her voice barely audible. "Lily? What's going on? Are you okay?" Sarah asked, sitting upright, her heart beginning to race. I think someone's watching me," Lily said, her voice cracking. "I'm in Clearwater. At the lodge. Please, Sarah, come get me. Don't tell anyone. Just come." Before Sarah could respond, there was a faint rustling sound, followed by a distant thud. "Lily? Lily," she shouted into the phone, panic rising in her chest. The call abruptly disconnected, leaving only the cold, empty silence of the line. Sarah stared at her phone, her hand trembling. Clearwater? She didn't recall Lily mentioning a trip there. She quickly searched the name on her laptop. Clearwater was a tiny, nearly forgotten mining town in Montana, surrounded by dense forests and towering mountains. The few articles she found painted a bleak picture, a town plagued by tragedy and whispers of the paranormal. Decades ago, miners had vanished without a trace, and the town never recovered. A chill ran down her spine as she replayed the conversation in her mind. Lily sounded terrified. She wasn't the type to spook easily. If anything, Lily thrived on exploring eerie, abandoned places for her photography. For her to sound that afraid, something was very wrong. Sarah tried calling her back, but the call went straight to voicemail. She tried again. And again. Nothing. Adrenaline coursing through her veins, Sarah grabbed her car keys and a jacket. She didn't know what awaited her in Clearwater, but one thing was clear, Lily needed her. The drive felt interminable. The highway stretched into the darkness, flanked by dense woods on either side. The further Sarah drove, the fewer signs of civilization she saw. Gas stations and diners gave way to empty roads and shadows that seemed to grow taller and darker with every mile. Her headlights carved through the night, illuminating only what lay immediately ahead. At one point, her phone buzzed again, and she nearly swerved off the road in her haste to grab it. It was a text. From Lily's number. Her fingers fumbled as she opened it. "Stay away." Sarah's blood ran cold. She stared at the message, trying to make sense of it. Stay away? But Lily had just begged her to come. Was this a warning? Or was someone else using Lily's phone? She tried calling again, but it went straight to voicemail. Frustration bubbled up inside her. She slammed the phone down on the passenger seat and pressed harder on the gas pedal. By the time Sarah reached Clearwater, it was nearly 4 a.m. The town was eerily quiet, as though it had been forgotten by time. The streets were lined with dilapidated buildings, their windows dark and lifeless. A single street lamp flickered weakly, casting distorted shadows on the cracked pavement. She found the lodge at the edge of town, a large, rustic building that looked like it hadn't been maintained in decades. The wooden sign above the entrance swayed in the wind, the faded letters barely legible, Clearwater Lodge. The place radiated an unsettling aura, as though it were holding its breath. Sarah parked her car and stepped out, her boots crunching against the gravel. The air was biting cold, and the silence was oppressive. She hesitated at the front door, her hand hovering over the handle. A part of her wanted to turn back, to drive away and never look back. But Lily's voice echoed in her mind, scared, pleading. The lobby was dimly lit, with a single bulb flickering overhead. A desk bell sat on the counter, tarnished and dusty. Sarah rang it, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. After a moment, a figure emerged from the shadows. The lodge's caretaker was an elderly man with hollow eyes and a stooped posture. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if he were conserving energy. "Room," he rasped, his voice dry like crumpled leaves. "I'm looking for my sister," Sarah said. "Her name is Lily Bennett. She was staying here." The caretaker tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "No guests here," he said. "Haven't had any in weeks." Sarah's stomach dropped. "That's not possible. She called me. She said she was here." The man didn't respond. He simply stared at her, his gaze heavy and unsettling. Frustrated, Sarah pushed past him, her boots echoing against the wooden floorboards. She climbed the stairs, ignoring his protests, and began checking the rooms one by one. Most were empty, filled only with dusty furniture and the stale smell of abandonment. Then she found it. A room near the end of the hallway, the door slightly ajar. Inside, the bed was unmade, and a backpack sat on the floor, its contents spilling out. Sarah's breath hitched. It was Lily's. She rushed to the backpack, sifting through the items, a camera, a notebook, a sweater. Everything screamed Lily. But there was no sign of her sister. On the bedside table, she found a crumpled piece of paper. Scrawled across it in shaky handwriting were the words. "I heard them whispering at midnight. I saw their eyes." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. The room felt colder, the shadows in the corners darker. She grabbed the paper and stuffed it into her pocket. She needed to find answers, and fast. As she turned to leave, her phone buzzed again. Another text. From Lily's number. "Help me." The screen suddenly glitched, the text dissolving into static before going blank. Sarah stared at the phone, her pulse racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, lurking just out of sight. The creak of a floorboard behind her made her freeze. She spun around, but the room was empty. The silence pressed against her ears, thick and suffocating. "Lily," she whispered, her voice trembling. There was no answer. Sarah spent the rest of the night searching the lodge and the surrounding area, but there was no sign of Lily. By the time dawn broke, she was exhausted, her mind swirling with questions and fears. She stood on the porch of the lodge, staring out at the dense woods that bordered the town. She felt it in her gut. Lily was out there. Somewhere in those woods. But so was something else. Something that didn't want her to be found. Chapter 2: Arrival in Clearwater. The sun rose weakly over the horizon, its light barely penetrating the heavy gray clouds that hung over Clearwater. Sarah stood on the creaking porch of the lodge, clutching her coat tightly around her. The cold gnawed her skin, but it was nothing compared to the chill that had settled in her chest. Her sister was missing. And now, Sarah was certain this place wasn't right. The caretaker's denial, the cryptic note in Lily's room, the eerie texts, they all painted a picture of something much darker than a simple disappearance. Sarah scanned the surroundings again. The town felt lifeless, as though it had been abandoned long before she arrived. She could almost imagine herself in one of Lily's stories, those haunting photos of decaying buildings and forgotten places she loved to explore. Except now, Sarah wasn't just an observer. She was a part of this chilling scene. She needed answers. The lodge-keeper's warning. After catching her breath, Sarah went back inside to confront the caretaker. She found him in the dim lobby, hunched over a notebook that looked more like a ledger. He didn't look up as she approached. "Why did you lie to me?" Sarah demanded, slamming her hand on the counter. The sound echoed, loud and jarring in the stillness. "My sister was here. I found her things." The old man's sunken eyes slowly met hers. For a moment, he said nothing, his expression unreadable. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "You should leave." What? Sarah blinked, anger flaring in her chest. Leave? My sister is missing, and you want me to leave? You don't understand, the man muttered, his voice trembling. If she's out there, if they took her, there's nothing you can do. This place, it doesn't let people go. Sarah's breath caught. What are you talking about? Who are they? The man shook his head, his hands gripping the counter so tightly his knuckles turned white. You think this is just a town? A normal place? It isn't. Clearwater, he trailed off, his gaze shifting to the window, where the woods loomed in the distance. The forest has eyes. It sees you. And once it does, it doesn't forget. A shiver ran down Sarah's spine, but she refused to let fear take over. What happened to my sister? She demanded, her voice steady despite the knot of dread tightening in her stomach. Tell me the truth. The man's gaze returned to her, and for the first time, she saw something in his eyes, genuine fear. She went into the woods, he said. They all do, eventually. The whispers call to them, and they go. But they don't come back. Not the same. Before Sarah could press him further, he turned and shuffled away, disappearing into the shadows of the lodge. Her fists clenched. She didn't have time for cryptic warnings or ghost stories. Lily was out there, and Sarah was going to find her no matter what. The town's secrets. Sarah left the lodge and ventured into the heart of Clearwater. If she was going to find Lily, she needed to learn everything she could about this place. The streets were eerily empty, the air thick with an oppressive stillness. Broken windows and peeling paint gave the town an abandoned look, but here and there, she saw signs of life, a curtain twitching, a faint silhouette in a window. Her first stop was the general store, a small, cluttered building that seemed more like a relic than a functioning business. The bell above the door jingled as she entered, and an older woman behind the counter looked up with a start. You're not from around here, the woman said, her eyes narrowing. Her voice was laced with suspicion, but Sarah could tell she wasn't unkind. No, Sarah replied. I'm looking for my sister. Lily Bennett. She was staying at the lodge. The woman's face darkened. She's missing? Sarah nodded. I think she went into the woods. The woman's hands trembled as she set down the can she'd been holding. You shouldn't go looking for her, she said quietly. Not out there. Why not? Sarah demanded. What's out there? The woman hesitated, glancing nervously toward the door as though expecting someone or something to burst in at any moment. This town has its secrets, she said. Things people don't talk about. The woods, they take people. Always have. And the ones who come back, she trailed off, her voice faltering. What about the ones who come back? Sarah pressed. The woman's eyes met hers, filled with a sorrow that made Sarah's chest tighten. They're not themselves, she said. They're hollow. Like something else came back in their place. The journal. Sarah left the store, her mind racing. Everywhere she turned, people spoke in half-truths and warnings, as if the full story was too terrible to utter. But she wasn't going to stop. Not now. Back at the lodge, she searched Lily's belongings more thoroughly, hoping to find some clue about where she'd gone. Among the scattered clothes and camera equipment, she found a small leather-bound journal. It was filled with Lily's handwriting, messy and rushed. Sarah flipped through the pages, her heart sinking as she read the entries. Lily had been documenting her time in Clearwater, and the last few pages were unsettling. There's something off about this place. The people won't talk to me, and the woods, they feel alive. I keep hearing whispers at night, but when I go to look, there's no one there. I saw something today. A figure, standing at the edge of the trees. It didn't move, but I swear it was watching me. I'm not imagining this. I know I'm not. I heard them again last night. The whispers. They're louder now. I think they're coming from the woods. I have to find out what's going on. If I don't make it back, Sarah, I'm sorry. I love you. Tears blurred Sarah's vision as she closed the journal. Lily had gone into the woods alone, and now she was missing. Sarah had to follow her trail, no matter the risk. The forest beckons. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Sarah stood at the edge of the forest. The towering trees loomed like silent sentinels, their branches twisting together to form a dark, impenetrable canopy. The air was heavy, filled with the earthy scent of moss and decay. Sarah gripped a flashlight tightly, its beam cutting through the darkness. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, but she couldn't. Lily was out there, and Sarah wasn't going to leave without her. She stepped into the woods. The ground was soft and uneven, covered in layers of fallen leaves and tangled roots. The deeper she went, the quieter it became. Even the wind seemed to stop at the edge of the forest, leaving only the sound of her footsteps and the occasional snap of a twig. After what felt like hours, Sarah paused to catch her breath. She turned off her flashlight for a moment, letting her eyes adjust to the dim light. That's when she heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. Sarah. Her heart skipped a beat. She spun around, shining her flashlight in every direction, but there was no one there. Lily, she called, her voice trembling. The whisper came again, louder this time. Sarah, help me. The voice was coming from deeper in the woods. Sarah's grip on the flashlight tightened as she forced herself to move forward, her pulse racing. The trees seemed to close in around her, their twisted branches forming grotesque shapes in the dim light. Then she saw it. A figure, standing just ahead. It was shrouded in shadow, its features obscured, but Sarah could feel its gaze on her. Her breath caught as it slowly raised an arm, pointing deeper into the woods. Lily, she whispered, her voice barely audible. The figure didn't move. Then, in the blink of an eye, it vanished. Sarah's chest tightened as fear clawed at her, but she pushed forward. She had to. For Lily. But as she ventured deeper into the forest, the whispers grew louder, surrounding her, filling her ears with fragmented words and laughter that didn't belong. And in the distance, barely visible through the trees, she saw the faint glow of a fire. Chapter 3: The Fire in the Woods. The faint glow ahead drew Sarah like a moth to a flame. The forest was alive with sounds that didn't belong, whispers, low laughter, and the occasional creak of branches as though something unseen was shifting between the trees. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, but the thought of Lily kept her moving forward. As Sarah approached, the glow resolved itself into a small, flickering fire. It burned low, crackling faintly in the still air, but there was no one around. The forest floor was undisturbed, no footprints, no signs of anyone having been there. She circled the fire cautiously, her flashlight cutting through the dark, searching for any clues. Then she saw it. Near the fire, half buried in the dirt, was Lily's camera. Sarah's breath caught as she dropped to her knees, brushing away the soil with trembling hands. The camera was intact but cold to the touch, as though it had been lying there for hours. She turned it on, her heart pounding as the screen lit up. There were new photos. The first few were typical of Lily's work, pictures of the lodge, the town, and the surrounding forest. But as Sarah scrolled further, the images became wrong. One showed the edge of the woods at dusk, with a faint silhouette standing among the trees. Another showed the same figure, closer now, its features still obscured by shadows. The final photo made Sarah's blood run cold. It was a close-up of the figure's face, or what should have been its face. Instead, there was a featureless void, a blank expanse of darkness that seemed to swallow the light around it. And yet, Sarah felt it staring at her. Her fingers fumbled as she shut off the camera, stuffing it into her backpack. She couldn't stay here. Whatever had been watching Lily might still be close. The clearing. As Sarah pressed deeper into the woods, the whispers grew louder. They no longer sounded distant but seemed to come from all directions, threading through the trees and coiling around her like an unseen presence. Help me. The voice was unmistakable this time. It was Lily. Lily. Sarah shouted, her voice breaking. She broke into a run, her flashlight bouncing erratically as she pushed through the undergrowth. Branches clawed at her arms and face, but she didn't care. The whispers grew louder, overlapping and blending into a cacophony of voices, but she focused on Lily's voice, desperate to follow it. The forest opened suddenly into a clearing. Sarah stumbled to a halt, panting, her flashlight sweeping across the scene before her. In the center of the clearing stood a massive tree, its gnarled branches stretching toward the sky like skeletal hands. Strange symbols were carved into its bark, glowing faintly with a sickly green light. Around the base of the tree lay a ring of stones, each marked with the same symbols. And there, leaning against the tree, was Lily. Sarah's heart soared with relief as she ran to her sister, dropping to her knees beside her. "Lily. Oh my God, Lily, I've been looking everywhere for you." But as Sarah reached out to touch her, she froze. Lily's eyes were open, but they were vacant, unfocused. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her lips moved soundlessly, as though she were trying to speak but couldn't find the words. "Lily?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Lily's head turned slowly, her movements jerky and unnatural. When her eyes met Sarah's, a chill ran down her spine. There was something wrong, something missing. And then Lily spoke. "They're coming," she whispered, her voice hollow. "They don't want you here." The ritual tree. Before Sarah could respond, the forest around her erupted with sound. The whispers grew deafening, the voices blending into an incomprehensible roar. The ground trembled beneath her, and the air grew heavy, thick with an energy that made her skin crawl. The tree behind Lily began to pulsate, the symbols carved into its bark glowing brighter. The branches twisted and writhed as though alive, and a low, guttural growl echoed from somewhere deep within its trunk. "Lily, we have to go." Sarah grabbed her sister's arm, trying to pull her to her feet, but Lily didn't move. She simply stared at Sarah, her lips curling into a faint, eerie smile. "They won't let us leave," Lily said. "Not until it's finished." "What are you talking about?" "What won't let us leave?" Before Lily could answer, a shadow moved at the edge of the clearing. Sarah's flashlight flickered, and she spun around, her breath catching in her throat. Figures were emerging from the trees, tall, humanoid shapes with elongated limbs and featureless faces. Their movements were slow but deliberate, and as they stepped into the faint light of the clearing, Sarah saw that their bodies were covered in the same glowing symbols as the tree. Panic surged through her. She pulled at Lily again, harder this time. "We're leaving. Now." But Lily didn't budge. Instead, she lifted a hand, pointing toward the base of the tree. "It's almost done," she said, her voice distant. Sarah followed her gaze and saw what Lily was pointing at, a crude stone altar, stained dark with something that looked disturbingly like blood. The realization hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a tree, it was a place of worship. A ritual site. And whatever these things were, they were performing a ritual now. The choice. The figures began to close in, their movements slow but relentless. Sarah's flashlight flickered again, the beam growing weaker as the batteries began to fail. She gritted her teeth, her mind racing. She couldn't leave Lily here, but she also couldn't fight whatever these things were. "Lily, please," she begged, tears streaming down her face. "I can't do this without you. We have to go." Lily's vacant eyes filled with something that almost resembled sadness. "You have to go," she said softly. "They'll let you leave. But I belong to them now." "No!" Sarah shouted, shaking her sister. "That's not true. I'm not leaving you." The ground trembled again, and the whispers grew louder, almost unbearable. The figures were just feet away now, their presence overwhelming. And then, as if responding to Sarah's desperation, the tree's branches twisted violently, and a deep, guttural voice filled the clearing. It wasn't human, it was something ancient, something that had existed long before the town of Clearwater had been built. "Choose," the voice boomed, reverberating through the air. "Leave, or stay." Sarah's mind reeled. Leave, or stay? Was this some kind of sick game? She looked at Lily, whose expression had turned pleading. "Go," Lily whispered. "It's the only way." But Sarah couldn't. She wouldn't. Her grip on Lily's arm tightened as she made her decision. Chapter 4. Into the Dark. Sarah's heart hammered against her chest as the forest closed in, the featureless figures looming ever closer. The tree pulsated, glowing brighter with each passing second, casting a sickly green light over the clearing. The guttural voice echoed again, vibrating through the ground and her very bones. Choose. No! Sarah screamed, pulling Lily's limp body toward her. Her sister felt heavier than she should, as though the weight of the entire forest was pressing down on her. I'm not leaving without her. Lily's vacant eyes flickered with the faintest spark of recognition, but the pleading look she had given Sarah moments earlier was gone. Now, her face was empty again, her lips trembling as if caught in the grip of something unseen. You cannot save her, the voice growled, its tone colder, sharper. The pact has been made. She belongs to us. Pact? Sarah spat, her voice rising in defiance. She didn't agree to anything. You can't have her. The figures halted their advance, standing just at the edge of the clearing, their bodies swaying unnaturally in unison. One of them raised an elongated arm, pointing directly at Sarah. You are bound now, the voice declared. 2 paths. 1 fate. The ground beneath Sarah trembled again, and a deep fissure split through the dirt, separating her from Lily. The glowing symbols on the tree flared blindingly bright, illuminating the entire clearing. Sarah stumbled backward, shielding her eyes. When she looked up, the altar at the base of the tree had changed. It now held something new, an object wrapped in black cloth, pulsating faintly as though alive. Lily's head snapped toward the altar, her eyes wide with terror. No, she whispered. You can't let them finish. What? Sarah stammered, her mind racing. What do you mean? Lily's voice was frantic now, her words tumbling out in a rush. The altar, the ritual, it binds them here. If they finish, they'll take you too. You have to stop it. The altar's secret. Sarah scrambled to her feet, her eyes locked on the altar. The figures hadn't moved, they were watching her, waiting. The voice from the tree rumbled again, louder this time. Interfere, and the price will be your soul. Ignoring the threat, Sarah bolted toward the altar. The moment her foot crossed the ring of stones surrounding the tree, the figures surged forward, their movements faster now, more aggressive. She barely had time to react as one of them lunged at her, its elongated arms swiping inches from her face. Lily! Sarah screamed, her voice raw with desperation. Help me! For the first time, Lily moved. She pushed herself off the tree, her body trembling as though fighting against an invisible force. You have to destroy it, she cried, pointing to the object on the altar. It's the key to everything. Sarah's hands closed around the black cloth, and she yanked it away, revealing what lay beneath. It was a heart. Or at least, it looked like one. The organ was unnaturally large, pulsating with an eerie green glow, its surface covered in the same glowing symbols that marked the tree and the figures. As Sarah stared at it, a wave of nausea rolled over her. She could feel its power, its malevolence, like a physical weight pressing down on her. The voice roared, deafening now. Stop! The figures lunged again, but Lily threw herself between them and Sarah, her arms outstretched. Do it, Sarah, she screamed. Now! The destruction. With trembling hands, Sarah grabbed the pulsating heart. The moment her fingers touched its surface, a searing pain shot through her, as though her very soul was being burned. She cried out, but she didn't let go. The forest erupted into chaos. The ground shook violently, cracks spreading outward from the tree. The figures screamed a high-pitched, inhuman sound that made Sarah's ears ring. Destroy it! Lily shouted, her voice barely audible over the noise. Summoning every ounce of strength she had, Sarah raised the heart above her head and brought it down onto the altar with all her might. The organ burst open on impact, spraying a dark, viscous liquid that hissed and sizzled as it hit the stones. The effect was immediate. The glowing symbols on the tree dimmed, flickering weakly before disappearing entirely. The figures froze, their bodies trembling violently as though caught in a storm. One by one, they crumbled, their forms disintegrating into ash that was swept away by an unseen wind. The guttural voice roared one final time, filled with rage and anguish, before fading into silence. The aftermath. Sarah collapsed to the ground, her body trembling from exhaustion. The clearing was eerily quiet now, the oppressive energy that had filled the air gone. She turned to Lily, who was slumped against the tree, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. "Lily," Sarah whispered, crawling toward her. Her sister's eyes fluttered open, and for the first time, they were clear, free of the vacant, haunted look they'd held before. A weak smile crossed Lily's lips. "You did it," she murmured. Sarah pulled her into a tight embrace, tears streaming down her face. "I thought I'd lost you," she choked out. Lily shook her head weakly. "You saved me." The sisters sat there for a moment, clinging to each other as the forest around them seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. The tree, now devoid of its glowing symbols, looked like any other tree, tall, ancient, and silent. Escape from Clearwater. With Lily leaning heavily on her, Sarah made her way back through the forest. The path seemed different now, less hostile, less alive. The whispers were gone, replaced by the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. When they finally emerged from the woods, the town of Clearwater was as still as ever. But Sarah felt the weight of its secrets pressing down on her. "We're leaving," she said firmly, helping Lily into the car. Lily didn't argue. She simply nodded, her eyes filled with exhaustion and gratitude. As they drove away, Sarah glanced in the rearview mirror. The forest loomed in the distance, its dark silhouette fading into the horizon. But just before it disappeared from view, Sarah thought she saw something, a figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching them. The final message. Days later, back at home, Sarah sat with Lily on the couch, flipping through her sister's journal. The entries were disjointed, filled with fragments of thoughts and observations that hinted at the horrors they had faced. But one entry stood out. It was dated just before Lily's disappearance, written in shaky handwriting. "The forest has eyes. It sees you. And once it does, it doesn't forget." Sarah's phone buzzed on the table. She picked it up, her stomach twisting when she saw the screen. It was a message. From Lily's number. "You shouldn't have come back." Sarah's blood ran cold as she turned to her sister, who was fast asleep beside her. The forest hadn't forgotten. And it never would. Chapter 5, The Forest's Reach. The message on Sarah's phone glared back at her, a cruel reminder that whatever they had escaped wasn't entirely gone. "You shouldn't have come back." Her fingers trembled as she reread it, her pulse quickening. It was Lily's number, impossible, yet undeniably real. She turned to her sister, who was still asleep, her face pale but peaceful for the first time since they had left Clearwater. Sarah's mind raced. Was this a cruel prank? A glitch? Or something worse, something supernatural, reaching out even here, miles away from that cursed town? The phone buzzed again. Another message. "We are always watching." Sarah's stomach churned. She stood abruptly, stepping away from the couch as though distance could protect her. The air in the room felt heavy, oppressive, and her breaths came shallow. The forest had been alive, sentient, its presence palpable in Clearwater, but how could it have followed them? As she stared at the phone, another realization struck her. The words weren't just a warning, they were a promise. Shadows in the night. That night, Sarah locked every door and window, double-checking each one before finally retreating to her bedroom. Lily, still too weak to argue, had gone to bed earlier, her exhaustion evident. But Sarah couldn't sleep. She sat on the edge of her bed, the phone clutched tightly in her hands. She had scrolled through her messages countless times, hoping to find a rational explanation. The texts had no metadata, no timestamps, no traceable origin. They simply existed, like ghosts in her inbox. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of old wood settling. Sarah tried to convince herself it was normal, that the house always made these sounds. But deep down, she knew better. A sudden thud echoed from the living room. Her heart leapt into her throat as she grabbed the flashlight she kept on the nightstand. Slowly, She crept out of her room, her bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor. The living room was bathed in shadows, the dim light from the street lamp outside casting long, distorted shapes across the walls. Everything looked untouched: the couch, the coffee table, the bookshelves. But the air was wrong. It was thick, electric, the same sensation she had felt in the clearing back in the forest. And then she saw it. Near the window, etched into the glass, were symbols. The same glowing, otherworldly marks that had adorned the tree and the figures in the woods. They pulsed faintly, casting an eerie green light onto the floor. Sarah's breath caught. She stumbled backward, her flashlight slipping from her grasp and clattering to the ground. A shadow moved in the corner of her eye. She spun around, her back pressed against the wall, her eyes scanning the room frantically. The shadow moved again, this time closer, shifting unnaturally across the ceiling like it had no regard for gravity. "Lily!" Sarah screamed, her voice breaking. The bedroom door burst open, and Lily appeared, her face pale and drawn but alert. "What is it?" she asked, her voice hoarse. Sarah pointed toward the symbols on the window, her words caught in her throat. But when Lily turned to look, the marks were gone. Lily's secret. "What's going on?" Lily demanded, her voice rising. "Sarah, you're scaring me." Sarah shook her head, struggling to find the words. The symbols, they were there. And the shadows, she trailed off, realizing how insane she sounded. Lily stepped closer, her expression softening. "You've been through a lot. Maybe you're just... I'm not imagining it." Sarah snapped, her voice sharper than she intended. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "They're not done with us, Lily. That forest, it's still here. Somehow." Lily's face darkened, her eyes darting to the floor. "I know," she whispered. Sarah froze. "What do you mean, you know?" Lily hesitated, wringing her hands. "When I was taken, I wasn't just wandering the woods. I was pulled into something old and alive. It showed me things, Sarah. Things I can't unsee. It made me promise to bring it back." Sarah's stomach dropped. "What did you promise?" Lily's voice trembled. "I didn't mean to. I just wanted to escape. But now, I think it's coming for both of us. The mark." Sarah grabbed Lily by the shoulders, forcing her to meet her gaze. "We're not going to let it take us," she said firmly. "We beat it once. We'll do it again." Lily nodded weakly, but her eyes were filled with doubt. The rest of the night passed in uneasy silence. Sarah stayed awake, her flashlight in hand, watching the shadows for any sign of movement. By morning, the house was bathed in sunlight, and the oppressive feeling had lifted. But the relief was short-lived. As Sarah brewed coffee in the kitchen, her phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a message. It was a photo. Her hands shook as she opened it. The image showed the clearing in the forest, the ritual tree standing tall and unscathed. At its base, the altar was intact, the black cloth once again wrapped around the pulsating heart. "They've rebuilt it," Lily said from behind her, her voice hollow. Sarah turned to her, her mind racing. "How?" "We destroyed it. We ended the ritual." Lily shook her head. "It was never about ending it. It's about feeding it. It doesn't stop, it just starts over. The return. They couldn't stay. That much was clear. If the forest could reach them here, it could reach them anywhere." "We have to go back," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the fear bubbling inside her. Lily's eyes widened in horror. "Are you insane? Going back will only make it stronger. And staying here will let it take us." Sarah shot back. "We have to end this for good. Whatever it takes." Lily hesitated, her gaze falling to the floor. "If we go back, we might not make it out." Sarah stepped closer, placing a hand on her sister's shoulder. "We'll make it. Together." Lily swallowed hard, then nodded. Okay, let's finish this. Back to Clearwater. The drive to Clearwater was silent, the tension between the sisters palpable. As they approached the town, the air grew heavier, darker, as though the forest itself was aware of their return. When they reached the edge of the woods, Sarah parked the car and turned to Lily. "Are you ready?" Lily nodded, though her hands trembled as she gripped the door handle. Together, they stepped into the forest, the path ahead dark and uninviting. The whispers started almost immediately, faint and distant but unmistakable. As they pressed deeper, the familiar clearing came into view. The tree stood as tall and menacing as before, its branches twisted and reaching. The altar at its base glowed faintly, the black cloth fluttering in an unseen breeze. The figures were there too, their featureless faces turned toward the sisters as they entered the clearing. "We end this," Sarah whispered, her voice filled with determination. Lily nodded, her fear giving way to resolve. But the forest wasn't going to let them win so easily. Chapter 6: The Final Confrontation. The clearing felt more alive than before, pulsing with an unnatural energy. The air was thick and damp, carrying an almost metallic tang. The glowing symbols etched into the tree flared brighter as Sarah and Lily stepped closer, casting eerie green shadows that danced across the clearing. The figures stood motionless, their faceless heads tilted slightly as if waiting, anticipating. The altar was the same as the last time Sarah had seen it, ominously pristine, as though it had never been destroyed. The black cloth shifted slightly, as if breathing, and beneath it, the faint glow of the pulsating heart was visible. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. Her mind raced with memories of the last time they had been here, the terror, the chaos, the near-death escape. She clenched her fists. "Not this time." "It knows we're here," Lily whispered, her voice trembling. "Let it," Sarah replied, her tone steely. The guttural voice returned, rumbling through the ground and vibrating in their bones. "You dare return," it said, low and menacing. "The pact was made. The debt must be paid." Sarah stepped forward, her eyes locked on the altar. "We're not here to pay any debt. We're here to end you." The voice laughed, a sound so deep and malevolent it felt like the ground itself was mocking them. The figures began to move, swaying in unison like reeds in the wind, their movements slow but deliberate. The bargain reclaimed. "You cannot destroy what is eternal," the voice hissed. "Your feeble attempts mean nothing. The forest grows. The forest devours. And you are already marked." Sarah glanced at Lily, who looked pale but determined. "We've heard enough of your threats," Sarah spat. "We destroyed the heart once, and we'll do it again." The ground beneath them shook, a deep tremor that threatened to knock them off their feet. "The heart was a fragment," the voice growled. "A single piece of a much greater whole. You cannot kill what is already alive." Lily stepped forward, her voice trembling but firm. "You think we're afraid of you? We know your secrets now. You've fed off this town for generations, taking what you want. But it ends here." The figures stopped swaying, their heads snapping toward Lily in eerie unison. "You think yourselves saviors," the voice said. "But you are nothing more than fodder." Suddenly, the black cloth on the altar flew into the air, revealing the heart. But this time, it wasn't alone. Tendrils of glowing green energy extended from the heart, connecting it to the tree, to the figures, and to the very ground they stood on. The heart pulsed violently, and the tendrils began to writhe. The fight for survival. Sarah didn't hesitate. She lunged toward the altar, her hands reaching for the heart, but the moment she crossed the ring of stones, the tendrils lashed out, one of them wrapping around her wrist. "Sarah!" Lily screamed, running to help. The tendril burned where it touched Sarah's skin, sending searing pain up her arm. She gritted her teeth, pulling with all her strength, but the tendril held firm. Another shot out, aiming for her neck, but Lily threw a rock at the altar, distracting it just long enough for Sarah to break free. "We need to destroy it," Sarah shouted, clutching her wrist, which was now covered in red, blistering welts. Lily grabbed a large branch from the ground and swung it at the altar, but the moment the branch made contact, it disintegrated into ash. The voice laughed again. "Fools! You cannot harm what you do not understand. Sarah's mind raced. The art was connected to everything, the tree, the figures, even the forest itself. Destroying it had weakened the entity last time, but if it truly was just a fragment, there had to be something more. Her eyes darted to the tree, its twisted branches looming overhead. The symbols etched into its bark pulsed in time with the heart, glowing brighter with each beat. The tree! Sarah shouted. It's the source. The ritual reversed. Lily didn't hesitate. She sprinted toward the tree, dodging the tendrils that lashed out at her. One of them grazed her leg, and she cried out in pain but kept moving. Sarah followed, grabbing a jagged rock from the ground as she ran. She reached the base of the tree and began hacking at its bark, aiming for the glowing symbols. Each strike sent a shockwave through the ground, and the figures let out an ear-piercing shriek, their bodies trembling violently. It's working! Lily shouted, joining Sarah in attacking the tree. The glowing symbols began to fade, their light flickering weakly. The heart on the altar pulsed erratically, its tendrils thrashing wildly as if in agony. The voice roared, its tone desperate now. You cannot destroy the eternal. You will pay the price. The ground beneath the tree split open, revealing a chasm filled with writhing shadows. The tendrils shot out from the heart, aiming for the sisters with renewed ferocity. One of them lapped around Lily's ankle, pulling her toward the chasm. She screamed, clawing at the ground as the tendril dragged her closer. Lily! Sarah screamed, throwing herself at the tendril. She grabbed it with both hands, ignoring the burning pain as she pulled with all her strength. Finish it! Lily cried, tears streaming down her face. Destroy the tree. The final strike. Summoning every ounce of her strength, Sarah grabbed the jagged rock again and slammed it into the tree with all her might. The bark split open, and a burst of green light erupted from within, blinding her. The tendrils recoiled, releasing Lily and thrashing violently as the tree began to collapse. The figures let out one final, deafening shriek before disintegrating into ash, their forms swept away by an unseen wind. The heart on the altar exploded, sending a shockwave through the clearing that knocked both sisters to the ground. When Sarah opened her eyes, the tree was gone. The clearing was empty, the oppressive energy that had filled the air now replaced by an eerie stillness. The forest falls silent. Sarah crawled over to Lily, who was lying on her back, breathing heavily but alive. Are you okay? She asked, her voice trembling. Lily nodded weakly. Did we do it? Sarah looked around. The forest was dark and quiet, the symbols gone, the altar reduced to rubble. I think so, she said, though a part of her wasn't entirely sure. They helped each other to their feet and made their way out of the clearing. The path through the forest seemed less menacing now, the trees no longer looming over them like silent watchers. When they reached the edge of the woods, Sarah turned back one last time. The forest was still, its secrets buried once more. We're free, Lily said softly, a hint of disbelief in her voice. Sarah nodded, though a small part of her wondered if the forest truly ever let anyone go. The final warning. Back home, weeks passed without incident. The nightmares faded, the wounds healed, and life began to return to normal. But one night, as Sarah sat alone in her room, her phone buzzed. She hesitated, her stomach twisting as she reached for it. The message was simple. The forest never forgets. Sarah stared at the screen, her hands trembling. She glanced out the window, half expecting to see the glowing symbols etched into the glass once more. But the window was empty. For now. True Scary and Horror Story number 2. Shadows of Innocence. Chapter 1, The Forgotten Past. The early morning sunlight filtered through the thin curtains of Emily's bedroom, casting faint, slanted shadows across the floor. For a brief moment, it felt peaceful. Quiet. As though the world outside her small house was still asleep, wrapped in a blanket of calm. But Emily knew better. Peace, for her, was a fleeting illusion. Her dreams had been darker again, more vivid, more persistent. The shadows had come alive, following her from room to room, lingering just behind her every step. She had awoken in a cold sweat, heart pounding as if the very essence of her nightmare had followed her into the waking world. It was always the same, a figure lurking at the edge of her vision, a sense of being watched even when there was no one there. The whispers, so faint, so low, would carry through the dream, though she could never make out the words. And that sensation, the one she could never shake, that presence in the dark, cold air, that had stayed with her since childhood. Emily sat up, her legs hanging off the side of her bed, her fingers brushing her temples in an attempt to stave off the remnants of the nightmare. She had no memory of her childhood, not clearly. Just fragments. Patches of images and feelings that never seemed to fit together. Her therapist had suggested she might have repressed the trauma. Emily wasn't so sure. How could someone forget everything, all at once? The memory of her family, their faces, their voices, the warmth of her home was gone. But there were things she could never fully escape. The darkness, the oppressive air that clung to her even during the day. It was always there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for her to remember. Emily shook her head, trying to push the thoughts aside. She had to get up. She had a class to teach. As a kindergarten teacher in a small town, Emily was surrounded by the innocent joy of children every day. The laughter, the noise, the simple wonder of their lives. It was the only time she felt normal, like everything was right with the world. But when the day ended, when the kids went home, the silence crept in again. And the nightmares came back. The day passed in a blur. Emily went through the motions, teaching, comforting, laughing with her young students. But it was all a performance. Deep down, she felt disconnected, as though she were floating above it all, looking down at the life she had built, but never truly part of it. By the time the last child had left, her mind was already elsewhere, back in that forgotten place. That house. She had never returned to it after her family moved away when she was young, but the house was never far from her thoughts. Every so often, the memories crept back. A room. A hallway. A face she couldn't place. She had never been able to explain it, but the house haunted her, even from miles away. She had heard stories about it from the neighbors. The house had been empty for years, the grounds overrun with weeds and wild vines. But it still stood, imposing and dark against the skyline. No one talked about it, not openly. The town had long since abandoned it, but it remained a fixture in everyone's minds. That evening, as Emily sat on her porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, her old friend Sarah showed up unexpectedly. Sarah had been Emily's childhood friend, her confidant, the one person Emily trusted before her memories became so fragmented. They hadn't spoken in years, but something about tonight felt different, urgent even. Emily, Sarah's voice was hesitant, as though she weren't sure what to say. Her eyes avoided Emily's, flicking nervously toward the ground. I heard you were back in town. I came back a while ago. Just trying to settle in again, Emily replied, her voice distant. She wasn't sure why she felt so uneasy. It had been so long, yet something about Sarah's presence felt wrong, as though the shadows of the past had followed her here. Listen, I've been meaning to talk to you about something, Sarah began, her voice trembling slightly. About your family. About the house. The mention of the house made Emily's chest tighten, her heart beating faster. What about it? Sarah paused, visibly struggling with what to say. Finally, she spoke, her words barely above a whisper. You need to stay away from it, Emily. You don't remember, but it wasn't just a house. There was something else there. Something dark. And it's still there. Emily's blood ran cold. Her thoughts whirled. What are you talking about? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. You don't remember anything about the night Lila disappeared, do you? Sarah's voice cracked, and Emily flinched at the mention of her sister's name. Lila, her older sister, had vanished when Emily was still very young. The police had found no trace of her. No answers. But the memory of her disappearance had been something Emily never quite understood. Sarah's eyes were full of sorrow, regret, but also fear. Fear that seemed to grow stronger with every word she spoke. I don't know how to explain this, Emily. But Lila, she saw it. She knew what was really going on in that house. And she tried to warn you. She tried to save you from it. Save me from what? Emily's voice was sharp, her heart racing. She didn't want to hear this. Not now, not when she was finally trying to move on. Sarah looked at Emily, and for the first time, Emily saw the depth of the terror in her friend's eyes. From the man, she whispered. From the shadow. The word shadow hit Emily like a physical blow, knocking the air out of her lungs. She had dreamed about the shadow. She had seen it, lurking in the corners of her memories. But hearing it spoken aloud was like a door opening to a place she wasn't ready to go. Sarah continued, her voice trembling. I don't know how it works. But that thing, it wasn't human. And it's still out there. Still waiting for you. Emily stared at her, too stunned to speak. The figure from her dreams, was it real? Had it really followed her from that house? Was it connected to Lila's disappearance? And what did it want? I don't know what to do, Sarah said, her hands wringing in distress. I'm so sorry, Emily. But I couldn't live with the guilt anymore. You have to know the truth. You have to stop it. As Sarah left that evening, Emily felt more confused than ever. The shadows were real. The house was real. The terror that had haunted her dreams for years, that was real. And somewhere, in the darkness, the shadow was waiting for her. Chapter 2, The Attic's Secret. Emily couldn't sleep. The words Sarah had spoken echoed relentlessly in her mind, a constant reminder of the darkness that loomed in the periphery of her life. The shadow. The man. The house. She had to know more. She had to understand what had happened to her family, what had been hidden from her, and why it still haunted her. The night was already heavy with the kind of silence that only exists when something dreadful lingers just beyond reach. She had driven past the house that afternoon, the eerie mansion on the outskirts of town. The broken windows seemed to watch her, and the overgrown ivy creeping along the walls almost seemed to reach for her, like cold fingers desperate to pull her back inside. It felt wrong, unnatural. But it also felt necessary, like some part of her soul was tied to the decaying structure, as if the house had never truly let her go. Emily knew what she had to do. She couldn't let the past remain buried. Not anymore. The following morning, she found herself standing before the gate of the house. It loomed before her like a tombstone, the air heavy with the smell of damp wood and mold. The long drive up to the house was lined with twisted trees, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal hands. The place was still abandoned. The windows were dark, the front door ajar, as though it had been waiting for her. But the house seemed different now, alive in a way that felt wrong. As if it were aware of her presence. Emily hesitated for a long moment, her breath caught in her throat. Was it a mistake to return? What if Sarah was right? What if it was better to leave the past alone, to let it rest in the dust where it belonged? But the pull was too strong. She had to understand. With a deep breath, she stepped forward, crossing the threshold of the house, feeling the air shift around her, thick and heavy, as if the house was breathing. Inside, the house was just as she remembered, and yet, not at all. The wallpaper, once a faded cream with delicate floral patterns, had peeled off in places, exposing the bare, rotting wood beneath. The air was thick with the scent of decay, but there was something else. Something colder. The first room she entered was the parlor. Dust covered everything, furniture, portraits, shelves. She ran her fingers along the back of a chair, her touch leaving behind a trail in the grime. The room was cold, unnaturally so. Her gaze was drawn to the fireplace, where the remains of a burnt-out fire lay in the grate. As she stepped closer, a soft, scraping sound caught her attention. It came from upstairs. Emily froze, her heart thudding in her chest. The sound continued, faint but unmistakable, the sound of something dragging across the floor. Slowly, cautiously, she turned her gaze toward the stairs. The steps creaked in protest as she ascended, each step an echo in the stillness. Her mind raced with thoughts she couldn't quite articulate. It was impossible. There was no one here. No one who could make that sound. But as she reached the top of the stairs, she saw it. The door to the attic was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness peeking through. The scraping sound seemed to come from behind it. Taking another step, Emily pushed the door open. The attic was everything she had expected and more. A dim, narrow space filled with old trunks, dusty boxes, and forgotten relics. The light from the small window cast long shadows across the room, bending them into grotesque shapes that seemed to move as Emily walked further inside. And then, there it was. A small, wooden chest, pushed into the farthest corner of the attic, half hidden beneath a blanket of old sheets. It was unremarkable, except for the strange carvings etched into the wood, deep gouges that almost looked like claw marks. Emily's pulse quickened. She didn't know why, but something told her that this chest held the answers. Her hands shook as she approached it. She had no idea what she was expecting to find, but the certainty in her gut told her this was it. The key to everything. She knelt down and opened the chest. Inside, she found a pile of old photographs, yellowing with age. But there was something else, a journal, bound in cracked leather, the edges worn from years of use. Emily's breath caught in her throat. The journal was familiar, its appearance almost identical to the one she had found in her dreams. Lila's journal. Emily opened the journal slowly, the pages creaking as they turned. The handwriting was familiar, though shaky, Lila's handwriting. The first entry was dated long before Emily had been born. Lila's words spilled onto the pages like a desperate cry for help. I see him again. The man in the shadows. He's been here, watching. Father says I'm imagining things, that I'm just being paranoid. But I know he's real. I know he's coming for us. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she read. Her sister had known. Lila had known. She had tried to warn them. The next page was filled with even more frantic writing. I can hear him at night, scratching at the walls. He's trying to get in. I know it sounds crazy, but he's not like the others. He's not human. He's something worse. Something ancient. And I'm not sure how much longer I can keep him out. The words blurred in front of Emily's eyes as she fought to hold back tears. Her sister had seen the truth, had known the horror that lurked just beyond their understanding. She had been trying to protect Emily, to keep her safe from whatever the man in the shadows was. But she had failed. The last entry was a jumble of words, as though Lila had been in the middle of writing something when she had been interrupted. It's coming for me. I can feel it. I have to leave. But I don't know how to escape it. The shadow, the man. Please, Emily, remember. The journal ended there. Suddenly, a cold gust of wind blew through the attic, scattering the papers around Emily like confetti. The temperature dropped so rapidly that she could see her breath in front of her. A shadow darted across the far wall, flickering like a living thing. The figure from her nightmares. Emily's blood ran cold as the scraping sound returned closer, this time, unmistakable. It was coming from the far corner of the attic, from the space where the shadow had appeared. The room seemed to shrink around her, the walls closing in. The shadow grew longer, stretching toward her, its presence suffocating. Emily turned to run, but as she took a step, a voice rang out from the darkness. You can't escape. Chapter 3, The Return. The attic door slammed shut behind her. Emily's heart lurched in her chest, and she spun around, her breath catching in her throat. The room had changed. The cold had become unbearable, the air thick and stifling as if the house itself had exhaled a cold, oppressive breath. The shadows in the corners of the room twisted unnaturally, their forms bending in a way that defied logic. She could feel them watching, waiting. The journal was still in her hand, but the words on the pages had become unreadable, smudged as though something had smeared across them. Emily dropped the book, her fingers trembling, as the room seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. The shadows seemed to close in on her, suffocating the very air in her lungs. For a moment, the entire attic went deathly silent. The only sound was her ragged breathing, echoing in her own ears. And then, faint at first, there was a scratching noise. Slow. deliberate. The unmistakable sound of something dragging itself across the floor. Emily backed away, her feet tripping over the scattered debris in the room. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her legs refused to cooperate. The shadow in the corner grew larger, stretching toward her like a living thing, creeping along the walls. And then it came. A figure emerged from the darkness, tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that twisted at unnatural angles. Its form was a blur of shifting darkness, its features hidden in a haze of black smoke that seemed to writhe and pulse. But its eyes, they burned with a cold, hateful fire, pinpricks of light in an otherwise featureless face. Emily froze, unable to look away. The shadow stared at her, its gaze heavy, suffocating. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to turn and flee, but she was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by an unseen force. The scratching sound grew louder, closer. The thing was moving toward her, its limbs scraping across the floor in a sickening rhythm. It wasn't just an apparition. It was real. It reached out with long, bony fingers, the tips of its nails scraping across the floorboards. A low, guttural voice filled the room, a voice that was both inside her head and in the very air around her. "You cannot escape me." Emily's legs finally gave out. She collapsed to her knees, her body shaking with a terror she couldn't comprehend. She had seen this thing before every night in her dreams. But this time, it was real. This time, it was coming for her. In a burst of adrenaline, Emily scrambled backward, desperate to reach the attic door. But as her hand gripped the handle, a sharp pain exploded in her chest, as if the shadow had reached out and gripped her very soul. "You will remember," it hissed. The voice was no longer a whisper but a scream, filling every inch of her mind. The attic door flung open, and she tumbled out, falling onto the staircase. She scrambled to her feet, her breath ragged, her mind spinning. She needed to leave. She needed to get away from the house. But as she reached the bottom of the stairs, she heard a familiar sound, the creaking of a door opening behind her. She turned, too afraid to look but unable to stop herself. There, at the top of the stairs, stood the figure. It was waiting. Emily didn't know how she made it outside. Her body felt as though it was moving on its own, driven by a primal instinct to flee. She burst through the front door of the house, the sunlight blinding her as she ran across the overgrown lawn, not daring to look back. She didn't stop until she reached her car, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the keys to start the engine. The car roared to life, and she slammed it into gear, speeding down the narrow road, away from the house. But even as the familiar town came into view, Emily felt a presence behind her. The shadows followed her. They were in the corners of her vision, in the reflection in the rearview mirror. And the voice, that hateful, distorted voice, whispered through the static in her mind. "You cannot escape." That night, Emily couldn't sleep. She lay wide-eyed in her bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. The figure. The shadow. Lila's journal. The house. It was all connected, but she couldn't piece it together. The journal had held the key, she was sure of it, but the last page, the one with Lila's final entry, was torn. Lila had written about the thing in the shadows. But why? What was it? How had it been tied to her family, to the house? And why had it waited until now to return? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of something tapping on her window. At first, it was soft, a light tapping, as if someone was trying to get her attention. Emily's heart rate spiked. It could be nothing, just the wind, or a branch brushing against the glass. But she couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. She slid out of bed, her feet cold against the hardwood floor. Every part of her screamed to ignore it, to hide, to run. But she couldn't. She had to know what it was. Cautiously, she moved toward the window. She could see nothing at first. The night was pitch black, the streetlights casting weak halos of light against the darkened world outside. And then, a face appeared. It was her own reflection, faint, distorted, staring back at her from the glass. But it wasn't quite right. Her reflection was twisted, its eyes hollow, the skin pale and stretched tight over the bones. The face smiled, its lips pulling back to reveal teeth that were sharp and elongated. Emily's blood ran cold. She stumbled back, knocking into her desk. The reflection didn't move. It remained, smiling, staring into her soul. And then, the face on the other side of the window spoke. "You will remember." Chapter 4, The Reawakening. The morning light offered no solace. Emily woke with the remnants of a nightmare clinging to her, the echoes of that distorted reflection still haunting the corners of her mind. She felt numb, exhausted, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows had followed her into her own home. They had stayed with her, hidden beneath her skin, lingering in the quiet moments when she let her guard down. The tapping on the window. That face. Her reflection. It was too much, too close. She couldn't keep running from it anymore. She had to go back. The drive back to the house was unbearable, the oppressive silence in the car only broken by the faint hum of the engine. The shadows in the corners of the road seemed to stretch out in the rearview mirror, following her like a dark, unrelenting tide. The unease in her chest grew with each mile. Every time she glanced at the mirror, she could almost swear she saw a shape, a shadow, flitting just out of sight. The closer she got to the house, the harder it became to breathe. When she finally arrived at the mansion, Emily sat in the car for several minutes, staring at the overgrown driveway. She was shaking, her hands, her legs. It was as if the house itself was pulling her in, urging her to return to the place she knew was the source of all this horror. She had to confront it. Confront the truth. The air outside was cold, much colder than it had been when she left, as if the house had begun to exhale once more. It was darker now, the sun hidden behind a thick bank of clouds. She felt it in her gut, the house was waiting for her. With a deep breath, Emily stepped out of the car, forcing herself to walk toward the front door. Each step felt like an eternity, as if the earth beneath her was shifting, warping. The house loomed ahead, its broken windows staring down at her like empty eyes, waiting. There was no escaping it now. The door creaked as Emily pushed it open, stepping into the dim, decaying entryway. The cold air hit her immediately, heavier this time, as though the house itself were breathing with a deep, unnatural sigh. The silence was thick, almost suffocating. As she moved deeper into the house, Emily felt the familiar dread rising in her chest. This was not a home. It never had been. It was a tomb, a place of death and decay, filled with memories that had been buried and forgotten. But they weren't forgotten. They were waiting to resurface, to claim her once again. She moved toward the stairs, each step echoing through the hollow silence. The scratching sound was back, but this time it was louder, more persistent, as if the house was calling to her. It was coming from the attic. She knew it. The attic door was ajar once more, the same crack of darkness from the night before, the shadows spilling out like ink. But this time, it was different. This time, the shadows seemed to reach for her, to pull her in, as if they were alive. Emily hesitated, but only for a moment. She had no choice but to face whatever waited in the attic. Whatever had been hiding there for so long. She pushed the door open, and the cold air that rushed out was enough to make her gasp. It was colder than the rest of the house, almost like a freezing wind had been trapped inside, suffocating. The shadows in the corners of the room stretched unnaturally long, twisted into grotesque shapes, like tendrils reaching out to touch her. And there, in the center of the room, was the chest. The same chest from the night before. But now it was open. Emily's heart skipped a beat as she stepped closer. The journal was lying on the floor, open to the last page she had read, the final entry from Lila. But something was different. The handwriting was no longer Lila's. It was hers. Her own hand was scrawled across the page, a frantic, hurried scribble that made her blood run cold. I remember now. The shadow never left. It has always been here, always been waiting for me. It wants me. It wants my soul. It is in the house, in the walls, in the very air we breathe. It will come for me, just like it came for Lila. It will take me. It has already begun. Emily stumbled back, her hands shaking uncontrollably. This couldn't be happening. She couldn't have written this. She didn't even remember writing it. But there it was, in her handwriting, her words, as if she had known all along what had been lurking in the darkness. Her breath came in short gasps as the air around her grew colder still. The shadows writhed, twisting, as if they were alive, as if they were sensing her fear. And then she heard it, the scraping sound again, closer this time, moving toward her. The door slammed shut behind her, and Emily spun around, her heart racing. The figure was there, standing at the far end of the room. The man, the shadow, the thing that had been haunting her dreams. It was real. It was here. The figure stepped forward, and Emily's breath hitched. It was tall, impossibly tall, its body a mass of shifting darkness, with limbs that twisted and bent in unnatural angles. The eyes, those eyes, burned with a sickly, yellow light, glowing like the embers of a dying fire. It spoke, its voice a rasping whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You cannot escape me, Emily. I have always been with you." She backed away, her mind spinning with the horror of what she was seeing. She had known it was real, had felt its presence every night, but now it was here, standing in front of her. She could feel its coldness creeping into her bones, its very presence suffocating her. The walls seemed to close in around her as the shadow advanced, its long, spindly fingers stretching toward her. "You are mine," it whispered, the sound like nails scraping against glass. "You always have been." Emily's breath came in shallow gasps. The fear in her chest was overwhelming, suffocating. She had to do something, anything, to stop it. But how? What could she do against something like this? Then, a memory surged to the surface, something she had forgotten, something from her childhood. The attic. She had heard her mother talking about the house once, long ago. She had said something about a curse, about a presence that had been there before the family had even moved in. A spirit. A shadow. Emily's mind raced. The house wasn't just haunted, it was cursed. And the shadow had been waiting for someone to return, someone who carried the bloodline, someone like her. Her legs finally gave way as the weight of the realization crashed down on her. She collapsed to the floor, unable to stand against the force of terror and understanding. "Lila knew," she whispered, her voice shaking. Lila tried to stop it, but she couldn't. The shadow's laughter filled the room, low and mocking. It wasn't just a voice. It was everywhere, in her mind, in her very soul. And then, Emily understood. She wasn't meant to escape. She wasn't meant to survive. She was meant to fulfill the curse, to be consumed by the shadow, just like her sister. Chapter 5, Descent into Madness. The shadows in the room seemed to thicken, stretching towards Emily like hungry tendrils, drawing her deeper into their dark embrace. Her pulse thundered in her ears, drowning out everything except the sound of her own frantic breathing. The figure before her, its eyes gleaming like pits of burning coal, loomed larger, its presence consuming the space around her. It spoke again, its voice an eerie whisper that slid into her mind like ice on her skin. "You cannot escape me. Not now. Not ever." Emily felt as if the very air around her had frozen, constricting her lungs. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. All she could hear was the voice, the unmistakable promise of doom, and the frantic thudding of her heart. The figure took a step forward, its movements fluid and inhuman. Each time it moved, the floorboards groaned beneath its weight, as if the house itself was shifting, folding in on her. Emily stumbled backward, her eyes darting around the attic, searching desperately for any means of escape, but the door was gone. The room had become a prison, the walls pressing in on her from all sides. "This house has always belonged to me," the figure hissed, its words slicing through the silence. "Your family is mine. You are mine." Suddenly, a flood of memories crashed over her, fractured images of her childhood, of Lila's strange behavior, the haunted look in her sister's eyes. Lila had known something, but she hadn't been able to tell Emily. She had tried to warn her, but the curse, the shadow, had taken her first. Emily's knees gave out beneath her, and she collapsed to the floor. Her mind reeled, dizzy with the weight of it all. The terror of her sister's death, The bizarre occurrences that had plagued her since her return to this wretched house, it all clicked together. It wasn't just a haunting. It was a curse, a malevolent force that fed on the family bloodline, passing from generation to generation. Lila hadn't died by accident. The shadow had claimed her, just as it had claimed their ancestors. And now, it was returned. The figure stepped closer, its dark form filling the space around her. Emily's eyes darted around, her mind searching for anything that could help her escape. But there was nothing. Nothing except the creeping darkness that had overtaken the room. The figure loomed above her, and for a moment, the world seemed to blur. The light from the single bulb above flickered, casting the room into alternating flashes of shadow and light. She could see its eyes now, those cold, gleaming orbs that seemed to pierce straight into her soul. Lila tried to fight me, it whispered, its voice dripping with malice. But she failed. Just like you will. Emily's chest tightened, and she felt as though she were drowning in a sea of terror. But beneath the fear, something else stirred. A spark. A glimmer of defiance. She wasn't going to give in. Not like Lila. She forced herself to stand, even as her legs wobbled with fear. Her eyes locked onto the figure, and for the first time since she entered the house, she felt something like clarity. She remembered the journal, the final page, the words written in her own hand. She had written those words, not in a moment of panic, but in the knowledge that she was the one who could stop it. She was the key. As the figure reached out with its long, bony fingers, Emily clenched her fists, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She could feel the darkness pressing against her, trying to pull her under, but she fought it with everything she had. She would not become another victim. She would not let the shadow claim her. Her eyes fell on the chest, the same chest that had contained Lila's journal, the same one she had seen in the corner of the attic before. Something about it, the way it had been placed, the symbols etched into its surface, felt important. It wasn't just an ordinary chest. It was a vessel, a way to contain the darkness. She rushed toward it, her legs burning with the effort. She could hear the figure's laughter behind her, a low, cruel sound that seemed to reverberate through her bones. "You cannot stop me," it said, its voice thick with amusement. "You are mine, just like your sister." But Emily didn't stop. She reached the chest, her hands trembling as she forced the lid open. Inside, she found what she had been hoping for, another journal, this one old and worn, the leather cracked with age. It was identical to the one she had found earlier, but this one felt different. She could feel the weight of it, as though it held the key to everything, the truth of the curse, the key to destroying the shadow. But as she reached for it, a scream tore from her throat. A sharp, searing pain shot through her chest, and she staggered back. The figure had moved behind her, its long fingers sinking into her flesh, cold as ice, burning through her soul. "You think you can stop me?" it whispered. "You are nothing. You are already mine." Emily gasped, her body trembling as the pain radiated through her, but she refused to let go. She had to keep fighting. She had to break free. She wasn't just going to lie down and let this thing consume her. With all the strength she had left, Emily ripped the journal from the chest. As soon as her fingers touched it, a violent tremor coursed through her body, as if the very air around her had been electrified. The shadows recoiled, screeching in pain. The figure shrieked, its form flickering as if it were being pulled apart by an unseen force. "No!" it howled. "You cannot." But Emily wasn't listening. She didn't have time to waste on its empty threats. She opened the journal, her hands trembling as she flipped through the pages, desperate to find the one thing she knew was hidden inside. The ritual. The way to banish the shadow once and for all. Her eyes locked onto the page. The words were clear now, their meaning heavy with power. She didn't hesitate. She began to chant the words aloud, her voice shaky but growing stronger with each passing moment. The shadows shrieked, their form warping and thrashing as the room trembled with the force of her words. "I reject you," she whispered, her voice filled with defiance. "I am not yours. You are nothing." The owl shook, the walls groaning as if they were alive, and the shadow let out one final, deafening scream. Emily's vision blurred, her body lurching forward as the air around her grew thick with energy. The figure writhed, its form flickering like a dying flame, until, with one final, desperate howl, it exploded into nothingness. The room fell silent. Emily stood there, gasping for breath, her body shaking with exhaustion. The journal slipped from her hands, falling to the floor with a soft thud. The attic was still. The shadows were gone. She had won. The curse was broken. But as Emily took a step back, she realized something chilling. The house was no longer the same. It felt empty, lifeless, as if the very soul of the house had been consumed by the shadow. The air was thick with a suffocating silence, and the oppressive weight of the house's history seemed to press down on her. She had destroyed the shadow. But she had also unleashed something else. Something worse. And now, there was no turning back. Chapter 6, The Price of Freedom. The house stood silent now, a hushed echo of the chaos that had unfolded within its decaying walls. But as Emily took her first step into the living room, the air felt heavier than ever. The house seemed to groan beneath her feet, the floorboards creaking like a warning. She could feel the weight of something lingering, something unseen but ever-present. The oppressive silence filled the space like an old, forgotten curse, seeping into the cracks and corners where the shadow had once thrived. She had done it. She had banished the creature, the darkness that had plagued her family for generations. But the victory came at a cost. Emily could feel the sharp sting of exhaustion in every muscle, the ache of the terror that had nearly consumed her. But something was wrong. The house wasn't just still, it was too still. There was an unnatural calm that hung in the air, like the calm before the storm. The air felt too thick, too cold, as if it were waiting for something. And for a moment, Emily was gripped by a horrifying thought. Had she really broken the curse, or had she simply freed something worse? As she walked deeper into the house, she noticed the shadows, different now, darker, stretching unnaturally across the walls. They flickered like flames in the wind, curling in and out of view, as if they were alive, writhing, waiting for her to make a move. Every step she took seemed to disturb the stillness, the silence and the air growing heavier, pressing down on her chest. "It's not over," she whispered to herself, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. The house had changed. The shadows no longer clung to the corners, they were in the air, swirling around her, surrounding her, as if they had come alive with the energy she had unleashed. She had released something by breaking the curse, but she had no idea what it was. Emily's fingers brushed the walls as she moved through the hall, her footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness of the house. The temperature had dropped, and she could feel the cold seeping into her bones, making her skin tingle. But it wasn't just the temperature, it was the presence. The presence that had always been here, but now, it was different. It felt more potent, more powerful than before. And then, she saw it. At the end of the hallway, a door that had once been closed was now wide open, the threshold bathed in a dark, flickering light. Her heart skipped a beat, her breath catching in her throat as she slowly walked toward it. The door had not been opened before. She was sure of it. It had been locked, barred, like all the other doors in the house. But now, the darkness behind it was beckoning, pulling her in. The door creaked as Emily stepped into the room. The smell of decay and rot hit her immediately, a stench so pungent it burned her nostrils. The air inside the room was thick with dust and old memories, and the shadows twisted unnaturally, gathering around her feet like dark, sticky tendrils. She stepped further inside, her eyes scanning the room. It was the same room she had seen in her dreams. The same one where she had watched Lila fall into the darkness. It had once been a child's room, her mother's room, a place filled with the echoes of laughter and warmth. But now, it was nothing more than a crypt. The walls were cracked, the floor covered in rotting remnants of what was once a bright and welcoming space. And there, in the center of the room, was a figure. At first, it was only a shape, faint, indistinct, standing in the corner. But as Emily's eyes focused, the figure became clearer. It was a woman, or at least, it had once been a woman. She stood tall and thin, her clothes tattered and worn, her face obscured by a mass of tangled black hair. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes, those hollow, soulless eyes, stared back at Emily, filled with an emptiness that made her stomach churn. "You," the figure whispered, her voice low and rasping. "You are the one who freed us." Emily's blood ran cold. This was no ordinary spirit. She had never seen this woman before, yet something about her felt familiar, like a memory just beyond her reach. "You were one of them," Emily said, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and recognition. "Weren't you?" The woman nodded, her head jerking unnaturally. "I was. I am. We all are." Her voice grew darker, more guttural, as she stepped toward Emily. "You think you broke the curse, but you only released us. The shadow was never the true prisoner. We were." The woman's form began to shift and distort, her body stretching, her face warping into something grotesque. Emily recoiled in horror as the woman's limbs elongated, her fingers twisting into jagged claws. The room seemed to collapse inward, the walls bending and warping around her. "You freed us from our prison," the woman continued, her voice now an unholy screech. "You broke the chains. And now, you will join us." The shadows in the room swelled, filling every corner, every inch of the space. They crawled along the floor like living creatures, reaching out for Emily, wrapping around her legs, pulling her toward the center of the room. Her body went rigid, her breath hitching as she struggled against the growing darkness. It was too much. The weight of it, the pressure on her chest, the cold wrapping around her limbs, was suffocating. "No," Emily gasped, her voice barely a whisper. "I won't." But the darkness was relentless, pulling her in, suffocating her. The woman's twisted smile stretched across her face, her eyes gleaming with a satisfaction that sent a jolt of terror through Emily's spine. "You cannot escape," the woman hissed, her voice distorting into a growl. "You are one of us now." In that moment, everything changed. The air around Emily seemed to fracture, breaking apart into 1,000 pieces of light. A blinding flash consumed the room, and for an instant, the shadows vanished, leaving nothing but the empty void of the room. The figure was gone. The room was quiet again, and Emily was left standing in the center, gasping for air, her hands trembling. She looked around, confused, her mind spinning. Had it all been a hallucination? Had the shadow, the curse, finally claimed her mind? No, it was real. She knew it was real. As she stumbled backward, the room felt wrong. It wasn't just the darkness or the shadows, it was the sense that she wasn't alone. The walls seemed to press in on her, and for the first time, Emily realized a terrible truth. The curse wasn't just confined to the house. It had always been within her. It had always been a part of her family. She couldn't escape it. Not now. Not ever. And then, she heard it. A voice. Familiar, but twisted. "You can't outrun the past, Emily." Her sister's voice. Emily spun around, but there was nothing. The room was empty. Her heart raced, the fear clawing at her chest. "No," she whispered. "Lila? Is that you?" But the answer came in the form of a cold wind, sweeping through the room, carrying with it a whisper. "You are never free." Chapter 7, The Echoes of the Past. Emily stumbled back into the living room, her mind racing. The house was eerily still, and every creak of the floorboards felt like a loud scream in the silence. The darkness clung to the corners, no longer just a threat lurking in the shadows, but an omnipresent force that seemed to pulse with malevolent life. Her heart pounded against her chest, and each breath she took felt more labored than the last. She had heard Lila's voice. But that wasn't possible. Lila was gone, lost to the curse, to the shadow, to whatever force had plagued their family for generations. And yet, here she was, in the deepest recesses of her mind, speaking to Emily from the darkness. "You are never free." The words rang in her ears, an echo that refused to fade. Emily clutched her chest, feeling the weight of them settle on her ribs, squeezing the breath from her lungs. She had broken the curse, hadn't she? She had banished the shadow, driven it away with a ritual in the attic. She had seen it vanish, heard its cries, felt the last flicker of its existence burn out. But something had changed. something she hadn't anticipated. The house had shifted, and so had she. Emily's thoughts were spinning, but beneath the terror, a chilling clarity was beginning to form. She had thought the curse was something external, something tied to the house, to the shadow. But now, she realized, it had always been tied to her bloodline. Her family had been cursed long before she was born. The shadow wasn't just an entity. It was a part of them. It was a curse that had seeped into their souls, infecting every generation, twisting their fates. She had broken the shadow's hold, but in doing so, she had awakened something even more terrifying. The house seemed to pulse around her. Each creak of the walls sounded like whispers, like secrets buried deep within the bones of the house were being stirred. The air was thick, suffocating, and Emily could feel it pressing against her from all sides. It was as if the house itself had come alive, responding to her presence, to the disturbance she had caused by trying to break free of the curse. "What have I done?" she whispered to herself, her voice shaking with fear and regret. She had to find a way out. A way to escape not just the house, but whatever she had unleashed. But as she moved through the living room, the floor beneath her seemed to shift. The walls, once familiar, now felt foreign. They seemed to stretch and close in on her, warping, bending, as if they were breathing, alive in a way she couldn't understand. And then, she heard it again. The voice. Louder this time. "You can't escape." Emily froze. It wasn't just a whisper this time. The words were spoken clearly, with a malicious force, as if they were coming from the walls themselves. "You freed us," the voice continued, growing in strength. "Now, you will join us. You will never be free of this place." Emily turned in every direction, trying to locate the source of the voice, but there was nothing. The house was empty, the room still and silent. And yet, she could feel it. Something was there, something watching her from the shadows. She could feel the presence of the curse, lingering in the very air around her. "Lila," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of hope and dread. "Is that you?" But there was no response. The house didn't answer. Only the unsettling creaks and groans of its ancient bones filled the silence. Emily's heart raced, her skin crawling as she backed away from the center of the room. She had to leave. She had to get out of here before it swallowed her whole, before whatever dark presence lurked in the house claimed her as it had claimed her sister. She turned and bolted for the front door. But as she reached the threshold, her hand gripped the handle, only to find it cold and unyielding. She yanked it again, panic rising in her throat, but the door refused to budge. It was as if the house itself was preventing her from leaving, trapping her in its dark embrace. Her breathing became erratic, her chest tightening as the shadows seemed to close in on her. She was no longer just afraid of the house. She was afraid of herself. What if Lila had been right all along? What if the curse wasn't just a family secret? What if it had been inside her, growing with each passing year, feeding on her fears and her doubts, twisting her into something she was never meant to be? Her mind raced as she stepped back from the door, her eyes darting around the room for any escape. But it was hopeless. The walls had closed in. There was no way out. And then, the shadows moved. They twisted, like dark tendrils reaching out to claim her. Emily screamed, but the sound was drowned out by the cacophony of whispers that filled her ears. The walls seemed to close in on her, the very air growing thick and suffocating. The shadows were alive now, and they were closing in. In the center of the room, the figure appeared again. But this time, it was different. It wasn't just a woman from the attic, but a reflection of everything she had feared. The twisted, decayed version of Lila, the sister she had loved, the sister she had lost, now stood before her, her eyes hollow, her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. "You can't outrun what's inside you," Lila's voice echoed, but it wasn't Lila anymore. It was something darker, something that had taken her sister's place. "You freed the shadow, but it was never the shadow that held you captive. It was always me." Emily's heart froze. She had never understood. She had never known that her sister's descent into madness had been a result of something far more insidious than she had imagined. Lila had been the first victim, but Emily was no different. She had just been blind to it, blind to the curse that had been written into her family's bloodline, passed down from generation to generation. Now, it was too late. The shadows reached for Emily, wrapping around her limbs like cold, clammy fingers. She fought against them, but it was no use. The walls closed tighter, the room spinning, her head spinning. Her eyes darted around desperately, but everything felt distorted, warped, like she was trapped in a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. "You belong to us now," the voice continued, a chorus of whispers that filled her mind, drowning out everything else. "You will never escape. You will never be free." She fell to her knees, her body trembling as the shadows seemed to devour her. Her fingers clawed at the floor, trying to find purchase, but it was as if the very ground beneath her was turning to ash. The darkness was consuming her, pulling her into its depths, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. She was trapped. Her mind flashed to Lila, to her sister's empty, hollow eyes, to the memory of her laughter echoing in the halls of the house. And then, as if in a final moment of clarity, Emily realized the truth. It had never been the house that was haunted. It was her. And now, she would never be free. Chapter 8: The Gathering Darkness. The room spun wildly around Emily as the shadows closed in. She reached out, desperate to grasp anything that might anchor her to the world outside the growing terror, but there was nothing. The air thickened with an unholy chill, wrapping itself around her body, smothering her. Her legs gave way beneath her, and she collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. The shadows swirled, as if they were alive, feeding off her fear, pulling her deeper into their grasp. Her vision blurred, and in the haze, she saw it again. Lila's face, twisted and contorted, emerging from the swirling darkness. Her eyes, once full of love and innocence, were now hollow pits of despair, gazing at Emily with an expression of pure malice. "It's too late," the twisted version of Lila whispered. "You've released us. You've set us free, and now we will claim you. There is no escaping what you've done." Emily's body trembled, every instinct screaming at her to run, to escape, to wake up from this nightmare. But there was no escape. The shadows were too thick, too powerful, and they had her in their grip. The cold that had once been just a sensation now felt like ice creeping beneath her skin, freezing her from the inside out. She tried to move, to fight back, but the shadows held her down with an unrelenting force. "You were never meant to break the curse," the voice continued, its tone growing darker. "You were meant to keep it alive. And now that you've disturbed it, there's no going back. You will be one of us. Forever." The words were a dagger to Emily's heart. She had thought she was breaking the curse. She had thought she was saving her family, saving herself. But in truth, she had only set the curse free, unwittingly releasing it into the world once again. And now, the cost of her mistake was bearing down on her. "No," Emily whispered, her voice shaking with fear. "I can't. I won't." But the darkness laughed, the sound low and guttural, like 1,000 voices coming together in unison. It echoed through the room, reverberating in her chest, drowning out her thoughts. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, the sound deafening in her ears. The walls seemed to stretch, growing taller and taller, bending at impossible angles. The floor beneath her feet was no longer solid, it felt soft, as though it were made of shifting sand, sinking with each step she tried to take. Her limbs felt heavy, as if they were trapped in thick mud, pulling her deeper into the abyss. But through the haze of terror, something within Emily shifted. A small spark of defiance ignited in her chest. She couldn't just give in. She had come too far, fought too hard to be consumed by the darkness now. There had to be a way out, there had to be a way to fight back. "I won't let you win," she gasped, her voice barely audible against the crushing weight of the darkness. "I won't be one of you." And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Emily managed to pull herself to her feet. The shadows recoiled slightly, as if they had underestimated her resolve. She didn't know where the strength was coming from, whether it was the will to survive, or a final surge of energy from the remnants of her humanity, but she knew one thing for certain. She would not surrender. Emily stumbled backward, her eyes darting around the room as the shadows writhed around her. They were all around her, closing in again, suffocating her. But this time, she didn't panic. She focused, searching for anything that might help her. Her gaze fell on the mirror across the room. It was cracked and dirty, but through the haze, she could see her reflection. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror, but it was her face. She was still her. And then it hit her. She had never really been alone in this battle. Her mother's old journals, the stories she had heard as a child, the warnings about the curse, they were all connected. Her family had been fighting the curse for generations, passing down knowledge, rituals, and warnings. Emily had inherited more than just the shadow of the curse. She had inherited the strength to fight it. "I can break this," she muttered to herself, her voice gaining strength. "I can fight this." With renewed determination, Emily turned back to face the shadows, her breath steadying. The darkness recoiled slightly, as if sensing her shift in energy. She reached deep within herself, recalling the knowledge from the old journals, her mother's notes, her grandmother's warnings. The rituals, the symbols, the incantations. They had always known how to fight the curse. Emily just had to remember how to finish what they had started. She stepped forward, her mind focused. The shadows seemed to writhe in response, but Emily was no longer afraid. She raised her hands, whispering the words she had learned from the journals, an incantation designed to sever the hold of the curse, to banish the shadow once and for all. As she spoke the final words, the shadows screamed, an unholy, guttural wail that shook the very foundation of the house. The darkness pulsed and thrashed around her, but Emily held firm. The air was thick with a pressure that nearly crushed her, but she refused to let go. The words flowed from her mouth, each one stronger than the last, each one a strike against the malevolent force that had haunted her family for generations. The house trembled, the walls cracking and groaning as if they were alive. The darkness fought back, surging in every direction, but Emily held her ground. She was stronger now. She wasn't just fighting the curse, she was fighting for her family, for herself. And then, with a final, deafening scream, the shadows recoiled, retreating into the corners of the room, shrinking away from Emily's power. The air grew still, the pressure lifting from her chest, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Emily could breathe. The darkness was gone. But as the last of the shadow faded, Emily felt a chill run down her spine. The room was silent, the oppressive presence of the curse lifting, but something still lingered in the air. Something wasn't quite right. Emily glanced around, her eyes searching the room, but everything was still. The house was quiet again. The shadows had gone, but in their place, an emptiness remained. The fear that had consumed her for so long had lifted, but in its place was a new kind of dread, the uncertainty of what would come next. She had won. The curse had been broken. The shadow had been driven back. But at what cost? Chapter 9, The Price of Freedom. Emily stood in the center of the room, her breath still shallow, her heart pounding in her chest. The house had gone quiet, too quiet. The suffocating presence of the curse had dissipated, but the air was thick with an unsettling stillness. It was as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something. She could still feel it, the darkness, the weight of the curse, lurking beneath the surface, like a shadow that wouldn't quite leave. She had driven the shadows away, banished them from the house, but there was something else. A deep, gnawing emptiness had taken its place. Emily looked around the room, her gaze falling on the broken mirror. The glass was cracked, its edges sharp and jagged, reflecting the faint light that filtered through the dust-choked windows. She barely recognized the woman staring back at her. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and haunted, as if she had aged years in a matter of hours. Had she truly broken the curse? Or had she merely shifted it, pushed it away, only to find it waiting for her in a different form? The thought made her stomach churn. It had been hours since the last remnants of the shadow had vanished, but the house still felt wrong. The silence was deafening. Emily tried to steady herself, telling herself that she had done what she needed to do. The curse was over. The darkness had been driven out. But even as she repeated these words in her mind, they felt hollow. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching her, waiting in the corners of the room. "It's over," she whispered to herself, but the words felt like a lie. "It's over." The house creaked around her, the familiar sounds of an old structure settling. But there was something else, a whisper, faint at first, like a breeze stirring the dust. Emily's heart skipped a beat as the sound grew louder, more distinct. "You can't escape," the voice whispered, just beyond her reach. Emily froze, her blood turning to ice. She turned, her eyes darting around the room, but there was no one there. The silence pressed in around her again, thick and suffocating. She clenched her fists, her mind racing. It wasn't possible. The curse was gone. She had broken it. There was no more shadow. There was no more darkness. And yet, the voice lingered, echoing in her mind. The sound was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The whispers seemed to seep from the very walls of the house, curling around Emily like a tightening noose. She gritted her teeth, her nails digging into her palms as she tried to focus. "Stop," she muttered. "Stop." The voice grew louder, a low hum that reverberated through her chest. "It's never truly gone," the voice taunted. "The curse doesn't die, Emily. It just changes." A shiver ran down her spine. The voice wasn't just taunting her, it was mocking her, daring her to face the truth she had been too afraid to accept. She had been so focused on defeating the shadow, so intent on freeing herself, that she had never asked the one question that now seemed so obvious. What if the curse was never really about the shadow? Her mind raced as she pieced the fragments together. Her family's history, the old journals, the strange rituals, they all spoke of a curse that had been passed down for generations, a curse that was rooted deep within their bloodline. It wasn't just an external force. It was something inside them, something that had infected their very souls. And by breaking the curse, Emily had only exposed herself to it. She had released it from its prison, but now it had nowhere to go but into her. The air in the room grew heavier, the temperature dropping with each passing second. Emily felt the familiar chill creeping into her bones, seeping through her skin. The darkness had returned, not as a shadow, but as a weight inside her, pressing down on her chest. She staggered back, her hands trembling as she tried to steady herself. The walls seemed to close in, the air thick with a suffocating presence. The room was spinning, the edges of her vision blurring. She had to get out. She had to leave before it consumed her completely. But the door, she turned toward the door, and there it was again. The voice, coming from the walls, from the very air around her. "There's no escape," it whispered, cold and cruel. "You are part of us now." Emily's head felt like it was about to explode, her thoughts swirling into chaos. The curse had never been just about the house or the shadow. It had been about her all along. The shadow had been just a symptom of something far worse, something buried deep within her family's past. And now, Emily was the next in line to carry it forward. She stumbled toward the front door, her heart racing as she fumbled with the handle, but once again, it wouldn't budge. The house was locking her in, trapping her. The voice was everywhere now, echoing in her ears, louder than ever. "You can't run from what's inside you." Her breath caught in her throat. The words struck deep, hitting a raw nerve. She had been running from this, running from the truth. But now it was impossible to ignore. The curse had always been part of her. And no matter how hard she tried to fight it, no matter how hard she struggled, it was a part of her blood, a part of her very soul. The room seemed to pulse with the rhythm of her heartbeat, the walls narrowing in on her, the floor beneath her feet swaying as if the house itself was alive. Emily collapsed to her knees, her body trembling with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. She couldn't breathe. The pressure was too much. The walls were closing in. And then, just as the last of her strength began to slip away, she heard it. A voice, different from the others. A voice that wasn't mocking, but filled with pain and sorrow. "Emily." She looked up, her eyes wide with disbelief. The voice wasn't coming from the walls this time. It was coming from behind her. "Emily." The voice whispered again, softer now. "Don't let it take you. Don't let it claim you like it did with me." It was Lila. But it wasn't the twisted, dark version of her sister that had haunted Emily's nightmares. This voice was gentle, pleading. It was the real Lila, the sister Emily had lost. "You're stronger than this." Lila's voice trembled with fear. "You can break free. You can still stop it." Emily's heart raced, a flicker of hope igniting within her chest. Lila's voice, it was a lifeline, a thread of light in the suffocating darkness. She had been wrong. The curse wasn't a part of her family's bloodline. It was a disease, a sickness, and Lila had fought it too, just as Emily was now. "Lila?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "How? How can I stop it?" But Lila didn't answer. Instead, the voice grew fainter, fading away as the darkness closed in once more. Emily's pulse quickened. She had to act, she had to stop this before it was too late. But the owls wouldn't let her go. The curse was part of the owls now, and it would never let her escape. Not until it had claimed her. Chapter 10, The Final Confrontation. The owls had never felt this alive, nor had Emily ever felt so utterly trapped within it. The oppressive weight of the curse, her curse, pressed down on her, thick and suffocating. It wasn't just a physical presence, but an emotional one, gnawing at her sanity, threatening to fracture her mind. She pressed her hands to her face, trying to ground herself. The cold air stung her skin, as though it had become saturated with dread. Every corner of the room seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of the curse, each wall throbbing as if alive with malice. She had thought that breaking the curse meant freedom. But now, as the darkness closed in, she realized that it wasn't something that could simply be broken. It was a part of her, a stain on her very soul. The voice, Lila's voice, had been a fleeting glimpse of hope, a whisper that had briefly cut through the suffocating shadow. But now, it was silent. Lila was gone, just as she had been before. Emily had failed her. And she had failed herself. In the deepest part of the house, Emily stumbled forward, her eyes blurry with unshed tears. The words that haunted her mind became louder, more insistent. The whispers had become cries, groans, and then screams, all blending together, merging into one all-encompassing force. They filled the air, pressing against her eardrums as though trying to suffocate her. "There is no escape," the voice echoed, and it no longer came from the walls. It was inside her head now. "You are ours. You have always been ours." Emily grabbed her head, her fingers digging into her scalp, trying to block out the voices. Her vision swam as the walls around her seemed to stretch, warping in ways that defied logic. The house was twisting and changing, its very structure bending to the will of the curse. In the distance, a door creaked open, slammed open by some unseen force. Emily's heart lurched. She wasn't alone. "You cannot fight us," a voice whispered in her ear, sending a chill down her spine. "You are one of us now." Emily whipped around, her eyes darting to the door. Her pulse quickened as she saw the silhouette standing in the doorway. It was Lila, but it wasn't Lila, at least, not the sister she had known. The figure was pale, almost translucent, her eyes dark pits of despair. Lila's voice echoed again, but it was twisted, distorted, not the comforting tone Emily had heard earlier. "You've been running from this. But it's in you now, Emily. It always has been." The figure stepped forward, its movement jerky, unnatural. Emily's heart raced. The curse had done this to her sister, turned her into something other. A specter, a hollow version of herself. The realization hit Emily like a slap to the face. Lila had never been fully free, not even in death. She had been consumed by it. And now, the curse was reaching out to claim her, too. But Emily wouldn't let it. She couldn't. She had already lost so much. No, the word escaped her lips before she even realized she was speaking. She clenched her fists, trying to summon whatever strength she had left. "I won't let you take me." Lila's form faltered, a grotesque grin stretching across her face as the shadows in the room began to swirl and gather around her. The owl seemed to come alive, its creaking bones groaning in response. Emily's breath caught in her throat as the shadows began to twist, becoming solid and tangible, dark tendrils reaching out toward her. "You can't stop it," Lila whispered, her voice laced with cold malice. "It will take you, just like it took me. The shadowy tendrils inched closer, wrapping around her, pulling at her body, tugging at her very soul. Emily fought back, struggling to break free, but the darkness was relentless. The more she resisted, the tighter it gripped her. It was inside her, entwined with her very essence, and the curse was taking root. There was no escaping it. But then, just as her will began to falter, a flicker of light burst through the darkness. A light that seemed impossibly bright, so pure that it pushed the shadows back, just for a moment. Emily's eyes widened. Could it be? "Lila," she whispered, reaching out with trembling hands. "Please, I need you." The figure of Lila faltered again, her form flickering like a fading candle in the wind. For a brief moment, the shadows surrounding her seemed to shrink away, as if recoiling from the light. "You are not alone," Lila's voice echoed softly, her image wavering. "You never were." But the light was fading fast, and the shadows crept back, more furious than before. Emily's heart raced, her body growing weaker as the curse threatened to consume her. She could feel the pull, the insidious draw of the darkness calling to her, urging her to let go. And then, Emily understood. Lila's voice wasn't just a warning, it was a call to arms. Emily had to fight, not just with her body, but with her heart. The curse was tied to the house, to the very bloodline of her family. It wasn't an external force, it was something they had inherited, something they had always carried with them, passed down from generation to generation. It wasn't just about defeating the curse, it was about acknowledging it, understanding it, and breaking its hold from within. "I'm not like you," Emily said through gritted teeth, her voice firm. "I'm not like you, Lila. I won't let it take me." With those words, she focused all of her energy, summoning the will to fight back. She gathered every ounce of strength she had left, and with one final, desperate push, she broke free from the dark tendrils that bound her. The light burst forth again, blinding in its intensity, and the shadows screamed in fury as they were driven back. Emily closed her eyes, the brightness overwhelming, but she could still hear it, the sound of the curse writhing, struggling to regain control. She held on, pushing harder, her hands clenched tight against the power surging through her. And then, in an instant, everything stopped. The silence was deafening. The oppressive weight of the curse had lifted. Emily collapsed to her knees, gasping for air, her body trembling from the exertion. The house around her was still, the once constant creaks and groans silenced. It was over. She looked up, her heart heavy with exhaustion, but there was no sign of Lila. No twisted shadow. Only emptiness. And then, she heard it, a faint whisper in the distance. A voice, gentle and kind, almost as if it had never been tainted by the curse. "You're free now, Emily." Lila's voice. Her real voice. And in that moment, Emily knew that the curse was finally broken. The darkness was gone. True scary and horror story number 3. The Inheritance, Blood Runs Deeper Than Walls. Chapter 1, The Return. The storm had begun just as Sarah's car crested the hill, the relentless wind howling through the trees, pushing rain sideways in torrents. She squinted through the windshield, the wipers struggling against the sheets of water that blurred her view. She could barely make out the silhouette of the old mansion ahead, looming like a forgotten ghost. The familiar weight of dread settled in her chest, and despite her resolve, she couldn't shake the feeling that the house was waiting for her. Her father's death had come suddenly, a heart attack in the dead of winter. Sarah hadn't been close to him in the last years of his life. He had always been distant, buried in his books and business, with little time for family. But the house had always been something else, something alive. She remembered being a child, feeling its weight on her small shoulders, the coldness that permeated every room, even the ones where sunlight should have been welcome. As she turned the key to the gate, it creaked open with a groan, as though the house itself were welcoming her back with reluctant arms. The gravel driveway crunched beneath her tires as she inched forward. She could feel the house watching her, even from a distance, the windows dark and unmoving. The windows. She could never escape the feeling that someone, something, had been watching her from behind them, from the second floor, from the attic. It was a sensation that plagued her childhood and one that seemed to reappear every time she approached the house. The mansion was imposing, an old Victorian structure, its sharp angles casting long shadows across the grounds. Ivy crawled up the stone walls, and the roofline sagged under the weight of age. The iron gate behind her slammed shut with a finality that echoed in her bones. Sarah took a deep breath, forcing herself to ignore the pit of unease that had settled in her stomach. She wasn't here to be consumed by fear. She had a purpose now. The will. Her father's will had left her no choice. She had to return and live in the house for 6 months before she could sell it. A condition that, upon first reading, seemed bizarre. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized it might be her only chance to uncover the truth about her family, about the strange things that had always surrounded them. She pulled into the driveway and parked near the front door. The house stood before her, quiet, still. It was as if it were waiting, holding its breath. She felt the unsettling tension grow stronger as she stepped out of the car, her boots crunching against the wet gravel. The rain continued to pour, but it felt like nothing could wash away the feeling that the house was alive in its own way, watching, waiting. The door creaked open as Sarah approached. She hadn't unlocked it, hadn't touched the handle, and yet it stood ajar. A rush of cold air hit her as she stepped inside, making her shiver involuntarily. The smell of dust, mildew, and something older, a faint scent of wood and rot, clung to the air. It was the scent of abandonment, of a house left to decay. But there was something else, something strange, as though the house had been expecting her. She flicked the light switch, but the bulbs flickered and buzzed, then hummed quietly, as if reluctant to illuminate the room. The hallway stretched before her, dark wood paneling on the walls, a grand staircase that seemed to reach to the heavens, its banister chipped and worn from years of use. The silence was oppressive, but the house didn't feel completely silent. It was filled with whispers. They were faint, barely audible, but Sarah could hear them clearly, like the rustle of pages turning in a book or the murmur of a conversation from a distant room. Sarah. Her heart leapt in her chest at the sound of her name. She wasn't sure if it was real or just her imagination playing tricks on her. But the voice was there, a soft whisper that seemed to come from somewhere deep within the house, pulling her toward it. The hair on the back of her neck stood up. She hadn't realized she was holding her breath until her lungs ached, and she let it out in a shaky exhale. "Stop it, Sarah," she muttered under her breath, trying to shake off the growing sense of paranoia that clung to her. She knew the owls had always made her feel this way, but she had to be strong now. She had to find the truth. Moving cautiously through the hall, Sarah's eyes were drawn to a portrait hanging on the far wall. It was an old painting of a man, her father. But something was off. The face in the portrait looked different from what she remembered, older, more intense, with eyes that seemed too sharp, too focused. It was as if the man in the painting was watching her, his gaze never leaving her as she moved past him. Shaking off the feeling of being stared at, Sarah continued into the living room. She stopped in front of the fireplace, noticing the family heirlooms displayed on the mantel. But it wasn't the objects that caught her attention, it was the letter she found resting on the mantel, placed deliberately in front of the fire. Her father's handwriting, unmistakable even after all these years, was scrawled across the top of the envelope. The letter was sealed with the same wax emblem that had been used on her inheritance papers. Without thinking, she broke the seal and unfolded the letter. As the paper crinkled under her fingers, the words jumped out at her, as though written in a language older than time. "Sarah, if you are reading this, then you have already begun the process of discovery. The house is not merely a house. It is a prison, one that holds our family in its grasp. What you will find here is not just inheritance, but a curse, one that has haunted us for generations. Your mother was not lost in an accident. She was taken. And so were the others before her. You must understand this before it consumes you too." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She had always wondered what had happened to her mother, but this was something she hadn't expected. Taken? What did that mean? And who was us? Sarah's hand trembled as she read further, but the rest of the letter was smudged, the ink running as though it had been written in haste, and the last few lines were completely illegible. Her heart raced as she stared at the final words. "The key is waiting. You must find it. The key." The letter offered no further explanation, no direction, but Sarah could feel its urgency. She needed to find this key. Whatever it unlocked, it was the answer. But she could sense that the house was already shifting, already changing. The walls felt closer now, the air heavier. She could almost hear it. The house was alive, breathing, waiting for her next move. Then, with a sudden gust of wind, the door behind her slammed shut, sending a shockwave through the house. The whispers grew louder. Sarah. The temperature in the room dropped drastically. The letter fluttered in her hands as the wind spiraled around her. Her pulse quickened, her breath coming in shallow gasps. There was no turning back now. The house had claimed her, and it wouldn't let her leave until she uncovered its darkest secrets. Chapter 2: The Secrets in the Walls. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the house was alive, breathing alongside her, its heartbeat a distant from under the floorboards. As the wind howled outside, she held the letter tightly in her hands, her fingers stiff from the cold that seemed to seep into her very bones. The whispers had subsided for now, but Sarah knew they weren't gone. They were only waiting for the right moment to return. The temperature had dropped noticeably, and her breath clouded in the air as she turned from the living room. The front door had slammed shut with an almost deliberate force, and she now felt completely alone in the house, alone, but never unobserved. Taking a hesitant step forward, she moved through the grand hallway. The portrait of her father still watched her, its eyes unblinking, and the sense of being followed grew more intense with every step she took. She had to find the key. The letter had said nothing about what the key unlocked, but it had emphasized one thing: the house had a hold over her family, and whatever waited within these walls was far darker than she could have imagined. She passed through the hallway and entered the dining room. The heavy oak table in the center was covered in dust, its once polished surface now dulled with age. The chairs were pushed in neatly, almost too neatly, as though they had been waiting for her to sit down. She paused, the air in the room thick with a sense of stillness that felt unnatural. It was the silence that unsettled her most. The kind of silence that seemed to echo. Sarah. The voice was faint at first, just a whisper, but unmistakable. She froze. The sound had come from upstairs. Her body tensed as she glanced upward, instinctively looking toward the staircase. The grand stairs spiraled up into the darkness of the second floor, their banister worn smooth from years of use. She had to go up there. The letter had said the house held its secrets in its grasp, and she was sure the key she needed was up there. She took a deep breath and ascended the stairs, each step creaking beneath her feet. The house groaned around her as if it was waking from a long slumber, and every time she placed her foot on the next step, the sound of the whispers grew louder. By the time she reached the second floor, the air had become thick with an oppressive heaviness. The hallway above seemed endless, with doors leading into rooms she didn't recognize. The wallpaper was peeling in some places, revealing the faded plaster beneath, but there was no mistaking the sense that something was terribly wrong here. One door in particular stood out. At the end of the hallway, a small, unmarked door sat slightly ajar. She hadn't seen it when she had passed by earlier, and its sudden appearance made her pause. Something about the way it stood there, as though beckoning her forward, sent a chill racing down her spine. Sarah approached it slowly, each step deliberate. The whispers intensified as she neared, as if the house itself were urging her to open the door. The hinges squealed in protest as she pushed it open, revealing a darkened room beyond. The room was small, with a low ceiling and no windows. Dust motes floated lazily in the faint light from the hallway, giving the air a hazy, dreamlike quality. At the far side of the room stood an old wooden chest. It was large, almost too large for the space, and it seemed out of place here, as though it had been moved recently. She stepped inside, the floorboards creaking beneath her weight, and approached the chest. Her fingers brushed against the surface of the wood, which was strangely cold to the touch. She could feel a palpable energy in the room, a force that made her stomach tighten with a mixture of dread and anticipation. She had to open it. She knew the key she sought had to be inside. The chest opened with a soft, almost reluctant groan, revealing its contents. At first, she saw nothing but layers of old, yellowed papers and broken trinkets. But as she dug deeper, her fingers brushed against something smooth, cold, and metal. She pulled it out, a small iron key, rusted at the edges but unmistakably familiar. It was the key from the letter. As she held it in her hand, a sudden, sharp noise startled her. The door to the room slammed shut with a deafening bang, and Sarah gasped, her heart racing in her chest. The whispers were back, now louder than ever, swirling around her in a cacophony of voices. Some sounded like her own, others unfamiliar, distorted, and anguished. The temperature in the room plummeted, and Sarah could see her breath forming clouds in front of her face. The tea grew warm in her hand, pulsing almost like a heartbeat, and she realized with a jolt that the house was reacting to it. She needed to leave. But as she rushed toward the door, it slammed open by itself, revealing a dark figure standing in the hallway. She froze, her heart skipping a beat. It was a man, tall, shadowed, and draped in tattered black clothing. His face was obscured by the darkness, but she could feel his eyes upon her, cold and penetrating. "Sarah," he said, his voice a low rasp. "You should not have come." The figure stepped forward, and Sarah took a frantic step back, her pulse thudding in her ears. What are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rising storm of whispers in the room. The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, he lifted his hand, and Sarah's breath hitched as a faint light began to glow from his palm. The light was dim at first, but it grew brighter, revealing the figure's face. It was an older man, her grandfather, she realized, though his face was twisted, unnaturally gaunt, as if time had ravaged him in a way that made him look more like a skeleton than a living person. "Your family's history is cursed, Sarah," he said, his voice ragged. "The house has claimed us all, one by one. You cannot escape it. You must understand what your father did, what he sought." The whispers reached a fever pitch, the room vibrating with the intensity of their voices. What did he do?" Sarah's voice trembled as she clutched the key in her hand. Her grandfather's lips twisted into a grim smile, and he nodded toward the chest behind her. "The house keeps the answers, but you must choose, Sarah. What will you give to uncover the truth? What will you sacrifice?" Sarah felt a cold terror grip her heart, her breath coming faster as the walls of the room seemed to close in around her. The house was alive, yes, but it was also more than that. It had a will, and it wanted her to make a choice. The whispers rose in volume again, drowning out all other sound. But the voice of her grandfather remained clear in her mind. "Choose, Sarah. The house has waited long enough." Chapter 3: The House's Curse. Sarah could feel the weight of her grandfather's words pressing down on her chest, each syllable dripping with an eerie certainty. The house was alive, watching her, waiting for her to uncover its deepest secrets. She held the key tightly in her hand, her fingers aching from the iron's cold bite. It pulsed with warmth, as though it were alive in its own right. She couldn't tear her eyes away from her grandfather's face, which seemed to shift in the dim light, more skeletal than human. Why are you here?" Sarah managed to choke out, her voice trembling. The whispers seemed to grow louder, curling around her like tendrils of smoke, wrapping themselves into her mind, filling her with dread. "What do you mean by a curse? What is this place?" Her grandfather didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a slow step toward her, his eyes locked onto the key in her hand. The faint light from his palm flickered, casting jagged shadows across the walls of the narrow hallway. For a moment, he appeared to hesitate, as though he were weighing something in his mind. "The house will not let you leave, Sarah," he said at last, his voice low, gravelly. "It has been waiting for you. For your bloodline. It has claimed every generation before you, and it will claim you too, unless you do what must be done." The storm outside seemed to intensify, rattling the windows in their frames. The wind howled, and the sound of rain slamming against the house became deafening, but in that moment, all Sarah could hear was the pounding of her own heartbeat, echoing in her ears. She took a step back, pressing her hand to the wall for support. "No, I don't understand. What is this place? What did my father do? What do you want from me?" The figure of her grandfather seemed to shudder for a brief moment, his face warping into something darker, something more sinister. "Your father, he knew what was coming. He tried to protect you, But the house was too powerful. He thought that if he kept you away from here, you would be safe. But now you're here, Sarah. And it's too late. Sarah's mind reeled with confusion and terror. What had her father known? What had he tried to protect her from? The house had always been dark, oppressive, but she had never imagined it could hold this kind of power. The whispers were growing louder now, louder than ever before, and the light from her grandfather's hand flickered erratically, casting the hallway into deeper shadows. It was as if the walls themselves were alive, breathing, shifting. Sarah's vision swam in and out of focus as the atmosphere thickened, pressing in on her from all sides. Suddenly, a loud bang sounded from behind her, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy, slow, deliberate. She whirled around, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty, save for the portraits that lined the walls, portraits of her ancestors, staring down at her with cold, judgmental eyes. The footsteps continued, growing louder with each passing second. They were coming closer. Sarah, the voice of her grandfather, whispered again, but it wasn't his voice, it was a deep, guttural tone that seemed to vibrate through her bones. They are coming. The ones who came before. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The footsteps were no longer just in her mind. She could hear them clearly now, echoing down the hall. And they were growing closer. She turned back to her grandfather, her eyes wide with terror, but he was gone, vanished into the shadows. The whispers turned into voices, murmurs, fragments of conversations she couldn't quite make out, all of them jumbled together in a chaotic symphony. But then, among the noise, a single word stood out, clear as day: help. Sarah's heart leaped in her chest as she spun around. At the end of the hallway, she saw a door creaking open. It wasn't the small room with the chest, but another door, the one that led deeper into the house. The one she had never noticed before, but that now seemed to pull at her, beckoning her to come closer. The footsteps behind her had stopped, but the air was thick with the sense of something approaching. Something ancient. Something that had waited far too long to be set free. Without thinking, Sarah rushed toward the door. She didn't know why, but she had to open it. She had to see what was behind it. It was as if the house was leading her, guiding her to the truth. She shoved the door open and stumbled inside. The room was dark, save for a single light flickering from the corner. Her eyes adjusted to the dimness, and she could make out the faint outline of what appeared to be an old study, its shelves lined with books that seemed to have been untouched for years. Dust settled over everything like a shroud, but there was a smell here, something familiar, something she had forgotten until now. A smell of ink. Of old paper. Of secrets. On the desk, amidst a pile of crumpled papers, Sarah found another letter. She picked it up, her hands trembling as she unfolded it. Sarah, if you are reading this, you have come too far to turn back. The house is not what it seems. It is more than a place, it is a prison. Your family is bound to it, and we are trapped within it, unable to escape. We were cursed long ago, and the only way out is to break the cycle. You must destroy the source of the curse, but be warned, it will not be easy. The house will fight you. It will do everything in its power to keep you here, to keep all of us here. The key is your only hope. Find it, and you may yet save yourself. But you must hurry. The house is waking. Sarah's pulse thundered in her ears as she read the letter. It made no sense, but the urgency was clear. The house was waking. The curse was real. Her father hadn't just been hiding her away for no reason, he had been protecting her from something far more dangerous than she could ever have imagined. But there was more. The letter mentioned a source, the source of the curse. And the key. She held the key now, but it was unclear what it truly unlocked. Suddenly, the door behind her slammed shut with a force that shook the room. The lights flickered violently, and the temperature dropped so suddenly that Sarah's breath came out in visible puffs. She spun around, her heart racing, but before she could react, she heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps again, this time from within the room. Something was inside. Her eyes scanned the dark corners of the room, but there was no one there. The footsteps stopped, but the air grew thick with an overwhelming sense of dread. Then, from the corner of the room, the shadows began to shift. Slowly at first, as if something was moving beneath them, something that shouldn't be. "Sarah." The voice came again, low and rasping. Not her grandfather this time. This voice was much older, and it seemed to come from everywhere at once. The shadows in the corner began to writhe, curling and twisting like a living thing. She had to leave. She had to get out. But when she turned toward the door, she froze. The doorway had disappeared. There was only the wall now, solid and unyielding, as though the house had swallowed the entrance whole. She was trapped. Chapter 4: The House Awakes. The darkness in the room was suffocating, pressing in on Sarah from all sides. The walls, once familiar and unyielding, now seemed to pulse with life, as though they were alive and aware of her presence. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and she tried to swallow the fear rising in her throat, but it tasted like ash. The shadows in the corners of the room were no longer just shadows, they were something else, something that moved. A cold wind swept through the study, despite the fact that the windows were sealed tight. The temperature plummeted further, and Sarah could feel the chill biting into her skin. Her teeth chattered, her fingers numb as she gripped the letter in her hand tighter. She had to find a way out, she had to. "Sarah," the voice came again, this time closer. It was deep, hollow, and filled with a sense of foreboding that made her blood run cold. It was not her grandfather's voice anymore. No, this was something else entirely, something ancient, malevolent. She turned, her eyes frantically scanning the room, but there was nothing. No figure, no face. Just the ever-deepening shadows that seemed to slither along the walls like living creatures. The temperature dropped even further, and she could see her breath fogging in front of her, the air thick with a biting, unnatural cold. The shadows writhed once more, and then, with a deafening crash, the door behind her slammed open, as if something had flung it wide with a violent, unseen hand. The air was suddenly alive with sound, the creaking of the house, the groaning of the beams, the distant echo of something or someone moving through the walls. A surge of terror shot through Sarah's chest, but she couldn't stop herself. She rushed toward the open door, hoping, praying that it would lead her out of the room and back into the hallway. But as she crossed the threshold, she froze. The hallway was no longer the hallway she had entered just moments ago. It had changed. Where the portraits of her ancestors once lined the walls, there were now only empty frames, hanging crookedly, their glass shattered. The floor beneath her feet was covered in a thick layer of dust, and the air was thick with an overpowering stench of decay. It was as if the house itself had aged decades in the time it had taken her to walk through the study. A loud, guttural noise came from somewhere deep within the walls. It sounded like something, clawing, scraping. The hairs on the back of Sarah's neck stood on end, and her stomach twisted into a knot. She couldn't run. She couldn't even move. Her legs felt heavy, like lead. Every step she tried to take seemed to bring her further into the heart of the house, further away from any escape. The whispers were deafening now, swirling around her, gnawing at her mind. "Help me." The voice rasped again, but it was distorted now, barely a whisper. "You cannot escape, Sarah. You are already a part of it. You have always been." Her pulse quickened as her eyes darted to the end of the hallway. The light flickered once more, revealing a door, an unfamiliar door. It was larger than the others, almost imposing in its presence. Her hand shook as she reached for the doorknob, feeling an unnatural warmth radiating from it, as though something within was beckoning her closer. The whispers intensified, growing louder and more insistent. "Open it. You must open it, Sarah." Without another thought, Sarah twisted the doorknob and pushed the door open, her heart hammering in her chest. The room beyond was dark, but the faintest glow seemed to emanate from the center of the space. As her eyes adjusted, she saw it, an altar. An ancient, stone altar, covered in dust and cobwebs. The glow seemed to come from the altar itself, a sickly, greenish light that illuminated the room in an eerie, otherworldly glow. Atop the altar lay a book. It was bound in dark leather, its pages yellowed and worn with age. It was open, but the writing was indecipherable to her. Strange symbols and runes covered the pages, their meaning completely foreign, yet there was an undeniable sense of recognition. She knew these symbols, somehow, but they were from a place deep within her mind, a place she hadn't known existed. The house was calling to her. She could feel it, almost like a pulse running through the floorboards. The whispers were now a relentless tide, crashing against her consciousness, urging her to take the book. She hesitated, staring at the altar, her mind racing. Could this be the source of the curse? Could this be what her father had been trying to protect her from? Her breath caught in her throat as she took a tentative step forward, her hand reaching for the book. As her fingers brushed the cover, a deafening screech rang out from the walls, and the entire room seemed to shake violently. The book pulsed in her hands, as though it were alive, and the greenish light flared brighter, blinding her for a moment. Suddenly, the room seemed to close in on her, the walls contracting, the shadows reaching out to engulf her. Her body froze, as if the house had suddenly gripped her in its icy fingers. The door slammed shut behind her with a thunderous crash, and the light flickered out, leaving her in complete darkness. The whispers turned into voices that were not just in her mind now, but all around her. They spoke in a language she didn't understand, but she could feel the anger, the desperation in their tone. Sarah, Sarah, you are the last. Her heart stopped for a moment. The words reverberated in her skull, echoing in the silence. She wasn't alone. The shadows in the room seemed to shift and change, growing more solid, more defined. Someone was in the darkness with her. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized the truth. The house wasn't just a house. It was a prison, a place where the spirits of her ancestors were trapped, bound to the walls by the curse that had plagued her bloodline for generations. And now, she was part of it. The last in the line. Suddenly, she heard a movement behind her. Her heart skipped a beat, and she spun around, only to be met with nothing but darkness. But the sound continued, soft, scraping, like something dragging itself across the floor. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. It was indistinct at first, its form shifting in and out of the darkness, but as it stepped closer, Sarah saw it clearly. It was a woman. Her hair was long and black, flowing like tendrils of darkness. Her face was pale, gaunt, her eyes wide and empty. She reached out a hand towards Sarah, her fingers elongated and unnaturally long. The woman's lips curled into a twisted smile, and her voice emerged low, guttural, and filled with venom. You cannot run, Sarah. You are one of us now. Before Sarah could react, the woman lunged forward, her hand grasping Sarah's wrist with an icy grip. The touch sent a shock of cold through her body, and she screamed in terror. The room seemed to spin, the shadows closing in around her. She could feel the house pressing in, squeezing the air from her lungs, suffocating her. Let go, she cried, pulling away with all her strength, but the woman's grip tightened. The darkness enveloped her, and the whispers were now deafening, a chaotic frenzy of voices that filled her mind and drowned out all sense of reality. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The room went silent. The shadows receded. The woman was gone. Sarah stood alone in the center of the room, gasping for air, her heart racing in her chest. But she wasn't truly alone. The house was still there, watching her. Waiting. Chapter 5, The Art of the House. The silence in the room felt like a suffocating weight, pressing down on Sarah's chest, making it hard to breathe. Her heart pounded in her ears as she tried to comprehend what had just happened. The woman, no, the spirit, had vanished as quickly as she had appeared, leaving Sarah standing alone in the center of the room, trembling and gasping for air. But the oppressive feeling in the air hadn't dissipated. If anything, it was worse now, more intense, like the house itself was closing in on her, its walls pressing in tighter with every passing second. She turned toward the altar, her hand still clutching the book. It felt heavy now, heavier than before, as though it had absorbed something from the room. A strange energy radiated from it, a dark, pulsing force that seemed to hum under her skin. She had to know what was inside. She had to understand what her family had been hiding for so long. Taking a deep breath, Sarah slowly opened the book. The pages cracked as they unfurled, the yellow paper brittle beneath her fingertips. Her eyes scanned the strange symbols once more, but this time, something shifted. The letters seemed to rearrange themselves, the runes aligning into words she could almost understand. The language was ancient, something that didn't belong in this world, yet the meaning was clear as day. The book was not just a collection of forgotten rituals, it was a record of the curse that had bound her family for generations. "Sarah," she whispered to herself, her voice hoarse and weak. "It's all here. All of it." The curse had begun with her great-great-grandfather, a man who had dabbled in forbidden rituals, seeking power from forces beyond this world. The family had once been wealthy, prosperous, but all of it had come at a price. The ritual had gone wrong, and the house had become a vessel for the spirits that now roamed its halls. Her family had been bound to it ever since, their fate sealed by the dark power they had unwittingly unleashed. The book described how the spirits, angry, vengeful, fed off the bloodline, claiming each generation in turn. Those who were born to the curse line were fated to die within the walls of the house, their souls trapped forever in the endless cycle of torment. Sarah's stomach churned as she read the final words on the page. There was a way to break the curse, but it was dangerous, perilous, and would require a sacrifice, a life, a soul. To break the curse, you must give what is demanded. Blood for blood. Life for life. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized the truth. The key, the one her grandfather had given her, was not just a symbol of her family's history, it was the key to the house's heart, the heart of the curse itself. And she, Sarah, was the one who was meant to make the sacrifice. A cold shiver ran down her spine as she closed the book, feeling its dark energy pulse through her fingertips. She looked around the room, the shadows creeping closer, the walls seeming to close in around her. The owls had hurt her, sensed her realization, and it wasn't going to let her leave now. The whispers started again, rising from the very walls, the floors, the ceiling. They were louder now, urgent, frantic. But amidst the chaos, one voice rose above the others, a voice that was clear and strong. "Sarah." She spun around, her heart pounding, her pulse racing. But there was nothing there. Only the oppressive darkness and the unnerving silence that followed the voice. The air seemed to thicken, and for the briefest moment, Sarah felt as if the house itself were watching her, waiting for her to make her choice. Her mind raced, her thoughts scattered like leaves in a storm. She could feel the weight of the curse pressing down on her shoulders, the house tightening its grip on her every move. There was no escaping it. Then, as if guided by some unseen force, Sarah's eyes fell on a large mirror that hung on the far wall of the room. It was an antique, framed in dark, intricately carved wood. The glass was cracked, the surface clouded with age. But as she stared into it, someone reflected back at her. At first, she thought it was just her own reflection, but there was something wrong with it. The woman in the mirror looked the same, but her eyes were not Sarah's eyes. They were empty, hollow, as if the spirit of the owls had taken residence within her. "Sarah," the reflection whispered, its lips curling into a cruel, twisted smile. "You are mine now." The voice wasn't hers. It was darker, colder. It came from deep within her own mind, twisting and distorting her thoughts. The mirror began to crack further, spider-web-like fissures spreading across its surface. Suddenly, the image of the woman in the mirror shifted. Her smile widened, her eyes gleaming with malice. And then, with a sickening crack, the figure in the mirror stepped forward through the glass. Sarah screamed, stumbling backward, her heart hammering in her chest. The air in the room grew even colder, the temperature dropping to an impossible low. Her breath came out in visible clouds, but it was more than just cold. It was as though the very essence of death had settled into the room, filling it with a suffocating weight. The figure, now fully emerged from the mirror, was no longer just a reflection. It was real, its long black hair hung like a veil over its face, its pale, lifeless skin stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes were nothing but dark hollows, empty and devoid of humanity. It reached toward her, its fingers outstretched, its nails long and sharp like talons. Sarah took another step back, but her legs were trembling, her mind numb with terror. She had no choice but to run. She turned, bolting toward the door, but as she reached for the handle, a powerful force slammed into her from behind. She was thrown forward, landing hard on the floor. Her vision blurred as she tried to push herself up, but the figure was already upon her. "You cannot escape me," the voice whispered, as cold as death itself. "You belong to the house now. Forever." The figure's hand reached for her throat, its grip tightening like a vice. Sarah's breath was cut off as she struggled against the pressure, her hands grasping desperately at the cold, bony fingers. She kicked and thrashed, but the grip was unyielding. Her head swam, and the room seemed to tilt as she began to lose consciousness. But then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the pressure released. The figure recoiled, its form flickering and fading like a dying flame. The temperature in the room shot back up, and Sarah gasped for air, her lungs burning as she struggled to take in oxygen. She wasn't alone anymore. The house had fully revealed its presence, its hold over her undeniable. She could feel its malevolent force now, its dark, suffocating power wrapping itself around her, feeding off her fear. It was everywhere, and there was no escaping it. The voices, the shadows, the spirits, they were all part of the house, part of the curse, and they were all closing in on her. And in that moment, Sarah knew one thing for certain: she had to break the curse. No matter the cost. Chapter 6: Blood for Blood. Sarah staggered to her feet, her body trembling as she pressed her hand against the cold wall for support. Her breaths were ragged, her chest heaving as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. The room was silent now, but the silence was heavy, unnatural, as if the house itself were holding its breath, waiting for her next move. She clutched the book to her chest, its dark energy still pulsating against her skin. The words "blood for blood," "life for life" echoed in her mind, an ominous chant that refused to let her go. It wasn't just a solution, it was a demand. The house wasn't going to release her without a price. Her gaze fell to the key around her neck, the one her grandfather had entrusted to her. It felt heavier now, almost burning against her skin. She pulled it from beneath her shirt, staring at its intricate design. It wasn't just a key to a door, it was a key to the house's heart, the place where the curse could be confronted and, perhaps, undone. But at what cost? Whose blood? Whose life? A loud creak echoed through the room, and Sarah's head snapped toward the door. It had opened, revealing a long, dark hallway that seemed to stretch on forever. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the whispers had returned, softer now but insistent, guiding her forward. She hesitated for a moment, her legs trembling beneath her, but she knew she had no choice. She couldn't stay in this room, not after what had just happened. The house wouldn't let her rest. It would drive her mad, just like it had done to her ancestors. Gripping the book tightly, she stepped into the hallway, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The floorboards groaned beneath her weight, and the shadows seemed to shift and move, as if watching her every move. The whispers grew louder with each step, their voices overlapping in a chaotic chorus that made her head throb. The hallway twisted and turned in impossible ways, leading her deeper into the heart of the house. The walls were lined with portraits of her ancestors, their faces solemn and grave. But as she passed, their eyes seemed to follow her, their expressions twisting into something darker, more malevolent. "Help us," one of the voices whispered, low and desperate. She froze, her eyes locking onto the portrait of a woman with dark hair and piercing eyes. The woman's lips didn't move, but the voice was unmistakably hers. "Sarah, save us." Her breath hitched as she reached out, her fingers brushing against the frame. But as soon as she touched it, the eyes in the portrait rolled back, and the woman's face contorted into a grotesque mask of pain. A scream echoed through the hallway, and Sarah stumbled back, her heart racing. The house was alive, and it was suffering. She quickened her pace, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. They weren't just guiding her, they were urging her, pushing her towards something. Toward the truth. Toward the heart of the curse. The hallway finally ended in a large, imposing door. It was different from the others, larger and more ornate, with carvings that seemed to writhe and twist under her gaze. The key around her neck grew warmer, almost burning her skin, as if it were drawn to the door. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the key. This was it, the heart of the house. The place where it all began. The place where it could all end. But was she ready to face what lay beyond? The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices that drowned out her thoughts. She couldn't think, couldn't breathe. She had to act. Now! With trembling hands, she removed the key from her neck and inserted it into the lock. The metal was hot to the touch, and as she turned it, a low, guttural groan echoed through the house. The door creaked open, revealing a staircase that descended into darkness. A wave of cold air rushed out, carrying with it the unmistakable stench of death. Sarah gagged, covering her mouth with her hand, but she forced herself to step forward. The stairs were steep and narrow, the darkness pressing in on her from all sides. The whispers followed her, growing louder with each step. She could feel the house's eyes on her, its presence all around her, suffocating her. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. At the bottom of the staircase, she found herself in a large, circular chamber. The walls were made of stone, covered in strange, ancient carvings that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. In the center of the room was an altar, similar to the one she had seen before, but larger, more ominous. The book in her hands began to hum, its dark energy resonating with the room. She placed it on the altar, and as she did, the carvings on the walls flared to life, filling the chamber with an eerie, greenish light. The whispers stopped, replaced by a deafening silence that made her ears ring. And then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. It was the same woman from the mirror, her dark hair flowing like smoke, her hollow eyes fixed on Sarah. But she wasn't alone. Behind her, other figures began to appear, dozens of them, their faces twisted in anguish, their eyes filled with despair. "Sarah," the woman said, her voice low and haunting. "You are the last. The only one who can break the curse." The other figures began to chant, their voices blending into a low, mournful dirge. The walls seemed to pulse with their energy, the air growing heavier with each passing second. "You know what must be done," the woman continued, stepping closer. "Blood for blood. Life for life." Sarah's heart raced as she stared at the altar, the book, the figures surrounding her. She could feel the weight of their suffering, their desperation. They were trapped, bound to the house, their souls unable to move on. And it was all because of her family. Her hands trembled as she reached for the dagger lying next to the book. Its blade was ornate, its edge gleaming in the greenish light. She knew what it was for. She knew what she had to do. But could she do it? The woman stepped closer, her hollow eyes boring into Sarah's soul. "You must choose, Sarah. Sacrifice yourself, or the curse will consume you, just as it consumed the others." Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she gripped the dagger, her mind racing. She could feel the house closing in on her, its presence all around her, suffocating her. She had to make a choice. The chant grew louder, the figures closing in, their faces twisted with pain and desperation. The woman reached out, her icy fingers brushing against Sarah's cheek. "Do it," she whispered. "End it. Free us." Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she raised the dagger, her hand shaking. The room seemed to spin, the shadows closing in, the voices overwhelming her. And then, with a scream, she plunged the dagger into Chapter 7, The Last Sacrifice. The blade pierced the air, its edge gleaming with unnatural light as Sarah thrust it downward. But the dagger didn't strike flesh. It hit the book instead, the force shattering the eerie silence of the chamber like a gunshot. A wave of energy exploded outward, sending Sarah tumbling backward. The figures around her shrieked, their cries piercing and full of anguish as the book absorbed the energy. The room pulsed with a sickly green glow as the book began to change. The leather cover split, the symbols on its surface burning brighter until they bled off the page, twisting and writhing in midair. The glowing script floated upward, spreading like dark veins across the walls, pulsing with life. The owl screamed. It was no longer just whispers or groans, it was a full-bodied roar of rage and pain. Sarah crawled backward, her body trembling as the air turned electric. The woman, the lead specter, loomed closer, her face now twisted in fury, her hollow eyes blazing. "What have you done?" she hissed, her voice echoing off the stone walls. "I won't sacrifice myself," Sarah spat, forcing herself to stand despite the searing pain in her limbs. "And I won't let this curse take anyone else." There has to be another way. The woman's expression darkened, her skeletal hand reaching out. The icy grip of her fingers wrapped around Sarah's throat, lifting her off the ground. "You are a fool," the specter growled. "You think defiance can save you? The house demands its due. Blood must be spilled." The other spirits closed in now, their translucent forms flickering and swaying, their voices rising in a haunting chant. Underscore blood for blood. Life for life. Underscore. Through the suffocating pressure, Sarah's mind scrambled for answers. Her eyes darted to the dagger on the altar, then to the glowing veins of script spreading across the walls. The book had absorbed the curse's energy, its malevolence now physically manifesting. The realization hit her like a jolt of lightning. The curse wasn't just tied to her family, it was tied to the book and the house itself. If she destroyed both. Her hand shot out toward the dagger. With a desperate scream, she plunged it into one of the glowing veins on the wall. The reaction was instant. A deafening roar filled the chamber as the room shook violently. The vein of light sizzled and blackened, spreading outward like burning paper. The woman released Sarah, stumbling back as her form began to flicker. "No!" she shrieked, her voice splitting into a cacophony of tortured wails. The other spirits began to convulse, their forms growing unstable as the house itself rebelled. Sarah didn't stop. She staggered to her feet, grabbing the dagger and slashing at every glowing vein she could see. Each strike sent another wave of destruction rippling through the chamber. The air grew heavier, the temperature plummeting as the owl screamed in agony. "You don't understand," the woman cried, her form now barely holding together. "Destroying the owls will destroy us all. You'll doom us to oblivion." Sarah froze for a moment, her chest heaving. Oblivion. The spirits weren't just bound to the house, they were sustained by it. If she destroyed it, they wouldn't move on. They would cease to exist entirely. Tears burned in her eyes as she stared at the wailing spirits. They were victims of the curse, trapped in an endless loop of torment. Could she truly condemn them to nothingness? But then she thought of her family, her ancestors, her grandfather, herself. The owls had claimed enough lives. The curse had to end. With a guttural cry, Sarah slashed the final glowing vein. The chamber erupted into chaos. The walls began to crumble, the floor splitting open to reveal an abyss of swirling darkness. The spirits screamed, their forms unraveling like threads pulled from fabric. The woman lunged at Sarah one last time, her face contorted with rage and despair. "You think you've won?" she hissed. "The curse is in your blood. It will never let you go." Before Sarah could respond, the woman was torn apart by the collapsing chamber, her screams echoing into the void. The house was falling apart now, the stone walls crumbling, the floor buckling beneath Sarah's feet. She turned and ran, her body screaming in protest as she sprinted up the staircase. The whispers were gone, replaced by the deafening roar of destruction. She burst through the door at the top of the stairs just as the hallway behind her collapsed into darkness. The house was shaking violently, the walls splintering, the windows shattering. Sarah didn't stop. She raced toward the front door, her lungs burning, her vision blurred. As she crossed the threshold, the house let out one final, ear-splitting scream. Sarah dove onto the front lawn, rolling to a stop just as the entire structure imploded. Dust and debris filled the air as Sarah lay on the ground, her chest heaving, her body trembling. The house was gone. Nothing remained but a smoldering pile of rubble. For a long moment, she just lay there, staring up at the night sky. The stars were bright, unclouded by the oppressive presence of the house. The air was still, peaceful. It was over. But as she sat up, a cold chill ran down her spine. Her hand went to her neck, feeling the spot where the key had once hung. It was gone. Her gaze shifted to the rubble, where a faint, greenish glow pulsed from beneath the debris. The curse wasn't finished with her yet. True Scary and Horror Story number 4. Locked Room. Chapter 1, The Invitation. Claire Ramsey sat in her dimly lit apartment, the glow of her laptop screen casting long shadows on the walls. Her inbox was a wasteland of rejection letters, spam, and unanswered pitches. The coffee in her mug had long gone cold, but she didn't care. She was too busy scrolling, hoping, praying for something, anything that could save her crumbling career. It hadn't always been this way. 5 years ago, Claire had been the rising star of investigative journalism. Her exposé on corruption in the local police force had earned her awards and a brief stint on morning television. But the glory didn't last. Her next few pieces failed to gain traction, and editors began dismissing her work as sensationalist. Before she knew it, she was freelancing to pay the bills, her reputation tarnished by whispers of desperation and burnout. Tonight felt like every other night, a dead end. Until she saw it. The email appeared in her inbox like a ghost, with no subject line and no sender she recognized. She almost deleted it, assuming it was another scam. But something stopped her. The body of the email contained just one line. If you're seeking a story that no one dares to tell, come to 304 Willow Lane, Friday night. Bring no one. Claire's heart skipped a beat. It could have been a prank, some idiot messing with her. But what if it wasn't? What if this was the break she'd been waiting for? She reread the message, her pulse quickening. A quick Google search revealed little about the address. 304 Willow Lane was in a decaying neighborhood on the outskirts of town, a place where property values had plummeted after a string of violent crimes years ago. No one seemed to live there anymore. Great, she muttered to herself. A creepy abandoned house. What could possibly go wrong? Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than coincidence. The timing, the phrasing, it felt personal. Whoever had sent the email knew her, knew what she was looking for. By the time Friday rolled around, Claire had convinced herself that this was her chance to claw her way back to relevance. She packed her bag with a flashlight, a recorder, and a canister of pepper spray just in case. The drive to Willow Lane was uneventful but unsettling. The further she went, the more the streets seemed to empty, until she was surrounded by derelict buildings and overgrown lots. Her GPS announced her arrival with an almost mocking cheerfulness. You have reached your destination. Claire parked her car and stepped out, the air sharp with the scent of decaying leaves. The house stood at the end of the street, its silhouette dark and foreboding against the evening sky. The first thing she noticed was the front door, slightly ajar. A faint glow emanated from inside, like a dying ember barely holding onto life. She hesitated, glancing around. The neighborhood was deathly quiet, no barking dogs, no passing cars. Just silence. Her instincts screamed at her to turn back. But she had come too far to back out now. Taking a deep breath, she walked up the cracked stone path and pushed the door open. The inside of the house was worse than she'd imagined. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and something metallic, like old pennies. The walls were peeling, revealing layers of stained wallpaper underneath. A single oil lamp sat on a table in the foyer, its flickering flame casting eerie shadows that seemed to dance and writhe. Beside the lamp lay a folded note. With trembling hands, Claire picked it up. Second floor. Last room on the left. Her stomach tightened. The handwriting was spidery and uneven, as if whoever wrote it had done so in a hurry or with trembling hands. "Hello," she called out, her voice echoing through the empty house. No answer. She glanced back at the open door, considering leaving. But the promise of a story pushed her forward. She pocketed the note and began climbing the stairs, each step creaking under her weight. The second floor hallway stretched out before her like the gullet of some great beast, its walls lined with closed doors. At the end of the hall, one door stood slightly ajar. Claire's pulse quickened as she approached. She pushed the door open and stepped inside, her flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The room was empty, save for a single chair in the center. On the chair sat a vintage cassette recorder, the kind she hadn't seen since her college journalism classes. Beside it was another note. Press play. Claire hesitated. Her instincts told her this was a bad idea, a very bad idea. But curiosity overruled caution. She pressed the button. The tape whirred to life, and a distorted voice crackled through the speakers. "Welcome, Claire." She froze. How did they know her name? You are not the first to enter this house, but you might be the last. This place has a story, one that has been buried for decades. You came here seeking the truth, didn't you? Sit down. Lock the door. And listen carefully. Your life depends on it. Her breath caught in her throat. She glanced at the door, wondering if she should leave, but the voice continued. If you leave now, the story ends here. But if you stay, you'll understand why no one ever leaves this house the same. The tape clicked off, leaving her in silence. Claire stared at the recorder, her mind racing. She should have felt fear, terror, even, but what she felt was a strange pull, an irresistible need to know more. She reached out to lock the door. Chapter 2, The Locked Room. The lock clicked into place with a metallic finality, and Claire felt a chill run down her spine. The air in the room seemed heavier now, like the house itself was holding its breath. She stood there for a moment, staring at the door, half expecting it to burst open or for someone to knock. But the only sound was the faint hum of her own nervous breathing. She turned back to the cassette recorder, now silent on the chair. Her flashlight cast long, flickering shadows on the walls, making the peeling wallpaper look like jagged teeth. What the hell am I doing? Claire whispered to herself. A faint noise interrupted her thoughts. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, like the sound of fabric brushing against wood. She froze, her ears straining to pinpoint the source. It was coming from the walls. She turned toward the sound, her flashlight beam trembling as she raised it. The noise grew louder, a faint scratching, slow and deliberate, as if someone or something was inside the walls, trying to claw its way out. Hello? Claire's voice was barely audible, her throat dry with fear. The scratching stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening, and for a moment, she thought she'd imagined it. But then, the whispers began. At first, they were faint, like a distant breeze rustling through leaves. But they grew louder, overlapping in a chaotic chorus that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Get out. She's watching. You shouldn't have come. Claire stumbled back, her flashlight flickering as her grip faltered. She spun around, the beam darting across the room, but there was no one there. The whispers faded, replaced by a deep, guttural sound that sent shivers down her spine. It was coming from behind her. Slowly, she turned toward the chair. The cassette recorder had started playing again, though she hadn't touched it. The tape whirred, and the distorted voice crackled back to life. They've noticed you, Claire. You've awakened them. Who's they? She shouted, her voice cracking. The ones who never left, the voice replied, almost amused. They've been waiting for someone like you, a storyteller, a seeker. You're exactly what they needed. The lamp on the floor flickered violently and then went out, plunging the room into darkness. Claire's flashlight was the only source of light now, and its beam seemed weaker than before, as if the darkness were swallowing it whole. Let me out, she screamed, running to the door. She twisted the knob frantically, but it wouldn't budge. You can't leave yet, the voice said. Not until you understand. Claire pounded on the door, her fists aching with the effort. But the house didn't care. The wall seemed to hum with a low vibration, a sound that resonated in her chest and made her teeth ache. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it. At first, it was just a shadow, a faint outline on the far wall, barely noticeable in the dim light. But as she stared, it began to move. The shadow stretched and twisted, taking on a vaguely humanoid shape. It didn't have a face, just an empty void where its features should have been. And yet, she felt its gaze cold, piercing, and impossibly heavy. Who are you? Claire whispered, her voice trembling. The shadow didn't answer. Instead, it stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet being yanked by invisible strings. Claire stumbled back, her legs hitting the chair and nearly sending her toppling over. The shadow stopped a few feet away from her. It tilted its head, as if studying her. Then, without warning, it lunged. Claire screamed, falling backward onto the chair as the shadow passed through her. It felt like being plunged into ice water, every nerve in her body screaming in protest. She gasped for air, clutching her chest as the shadow disappeared into the floor. For a moment, there was silence. Claire sat there, shaking, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. But the house wasn't done with her yet. The whispers returned, louder this time, and with them came a new sound, a low, rhythmic thumping, like the beat of a drum. It seemed to come from beneath her, vibrating up through the floorboards. Gathering her courage, Claire aimed her flashlight at the floor. The thumping grew louder, more frantic, as if whatever was down there knew she was watching. Suddenly, the tape recorder clicked back on. "You feel it, don't you? The house is alive." "Alive?" Claire spat, her voice filled with both terror and defiance. "This is insane." "Insane? Perhaps. But that doesn't change the truth. This house has a story, Claire. A story that demands to be told. And you're the perfect vessel." Before she could respond, the floor beneath her chair cracked loudly, splintering as if something massive was pushing up from below. Claire leapt to her feet, her heart pounding. The crack widened, and through it, she saw something moving. At first, it looked like roots, dark, gnarled tendrils sneaking their way up through the floorboards. But as they emerged, she realized they weren't roots at all. They were fingers. Claire screamed and backed into the corner of the room as the fingers clawed their way up, pulling a pale, skeletal hand through the floor. It was followed by another, and then ahead a ghastly, eyeless face with a mouth that stretched impossibly wide. The thing pulled itself fully into the room, its movements unnervingly smooth, as if gravity had no hold on it. It turned its hollow gaze toward Claire, its mouth curling into a grotesque approximation of a smile. And then it spoke, not in words, but in a chorus of overlapping whispers that filled the room. "Tell our story, Claire. Or join us." Chapter 3: The House's Dark History. Claire pressed herself into the corner of the room, every muscle in her body taut with fear. The grotesque figure loomed in the center of the room, its hollow eyes locked onto hers. The whispers that emanated from its gaping mouth surrounded her, weaving a sinister tapestry of voices that seemed to come from within her own mind. "Tell our story," the voices repeated. "Or join us." I don't know your story," Claire stammered, her voice trembling. "What do you want from me?" The creature tilted its head, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette on frayed strings. Its smile widened, revealing rows of jagged, uneven teeth that glistened in the faint light. Without warning, the creature began to dissolve. Its body disintegrated into a black mist, which spiraled upward and vanished into the cracks in the ceiling. The whispers faded, leaving Claire in a heavy, suffocating silence. Her flashlight flickered, and for a moment, she was plunged into darkness. When the light steadied again, she saw something new in the center of the room, a small wooden box, ancient and worn, its lid slightly ajar. Against her better judgment, Claire approached the box. Her hand shook as she lifted the lid, revealing a stack of old photographs, a yellow journal, and a bundle of papers tied together with twine. She pulled out the top photograph and held it up to the weak beam of her flashlight. It depicted a family of 4, a man, a woman, and 2 young children standing in front of the very house she was in now. Their faces were unsmiling, their eyes dark and hollow, as if the camera had captured not just their image but their souls. Beneath the photograph, a name was scrawled in faded ink, the Whitaker family, 1953. Claire's heart sank. She'd read about the Whitaker family in passing during her research. They were local legends, the subject of whispered rumors and ghost stories. The father, Thomas Whitaker, was said to have gone mad and murdered his entire family before taking his own life. But the details were murky, the records incomplete. She flipped through the bundle of papers, her eyes scanning the faded handwriting. They appeared to be letters, written by Thomas Whitaker himself. The voices grow louder each day. They speak of blood, of sacrifice. "I fear they will not be satisfied until they have taken everything from me." Another letter, dated just days before the murders. "The house is alive. It watches, it waits. I see them in the shadows, the ones who came before us. They whisper to me in my dreams, showing me horrors I cannot escape. I fear the house will claim us all. Claire's hands trembled as she set the letter aside. She opened the journal next, its brittle pages filled with frantic, scrawled entries. The writing grew more erratic as the dates progressed, descending into incomprehensible ramblings. One phrase appeared repeatedly, etched deep into the paper as if Thomas had pressed the pen with all his strength. The room. It starts with the room. A loud bang interrupted Claire's reading, making her jump. She whipped around, her flashlight darting across the room, but there was nothing there. The sound came again, this time from the hallway. It was rhythmic and deliberate, like heavy footsteps approaching. Claire's breath caught in her throat as the temperature in the room plummeted. She could see her breath in front of her now, small puffs of white in the oppressive darkness. The door to the room creaked open, though she was certain she'd locked it. A shadowy figure stood in the doorway, its form barely distinguishable from the darkness around it. "Who's there?" Claire demanded, her voice shaking. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it stepped into the room, its movements slow and deliberate. As it approached, Claire realized it wasn't a person, it was a distorted mimicry of one. Its limbs were too long, its posture unnatural, and its face was a blank, featureless void. Claire backed away, clutching the journal to her chest like a shield. The figure stopped a few feet from her, tilting its head as if studying her. Then, without warning, it lunged. A piercing scream erupted from Claire's throat as the figure collided with her, its icy touch burning her skin. She fell to the floor, her flashlight skittering across the room and plunging her into near-total darkness. She scrambled to her feet, her hands fumbling for the flashlight. When she found it and turned it back on, the figure was gone. But the room had changed. The walls were now covered in writing, hundreds, maybe thousands of words, scrawled in a dark, viscous substance that looked disturbingly like blood. The words overlapped, forming a chaotic, illegible mess. Except for one phrase, repeated over and over. "They never leave." The whispers returned, louder and more insistent this time. Claire clapped her hands over her ears, trying to block them out, but it was no use. They were inside her head, gnawing at her sanity. "The house needs you, Claire. The house needs a storyteller." She sank to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "Why me?" she sobbed. "What do you want from me?" The whispers fell silent. And then, the distorted voice from the cassette recorder spoke again, though the recorder was nowhere to be seen. The Whitaker family thought they could leave. They were wrong. Now you understand, don't you? The house never lets anyone go. Claire stared at the box, at the letters and photographs spilling out of it. The truth was clear now. The house wasn't just haunted, it was alive, feeding on the fear and suffering of anyone who dared enter. And it wanted her to stay. Chapter 4, The Unraveling. The walls of the room seemed to pulse with an energy that Claire could feel in her bones, the oppressive force of it pressing against her chest like the weight of 1,000 suffocating hands. Her heart thudded in her ears, the rhythmic pounding almost synchronized with the thumping she had heard earlier from below. The room felt like a trap closing in, its walls narrowing, the air thick with whispers that seemed to seep from every crack in the floor, ceiling, and walls. "You can't leave." The words echoed inside her mind as clearly as if they had come from the very walls themselves. Claire shook her head, trying to clear her thoughts, but it was no use. The house had wormed its way into her mind. It knew her fears, her regrets, her deepest secrets. She stood up shakily, trying to steady herself. The room was still shifting, the shadows twisting in ways that defied logic. The photographs from the Whitaker family were scattered on the floor, each face staring back at her with empty, hollow eyes. But it wasn't just the photographs that unnerved her now. It was the feeling of being watched. She wasn't alone. Claire turned quickly, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The figure from before, no longer a shadow but a tangible presence, stood in the corner of the room, just out of reach of the light. Its long limbs stretched unnaturally, its featureless face tilting toward her. There was no sound, no movement, just a horrible sensation that it was drawing closer with every heartbeat. Her throat tightened. Not again. Not this thing again. The creature took a step forward, its feet making no sound on the floor. Each step was deliberate, slow, calculated, as if it knew that it could take its time. It was toying with her. Claire stumbled backward, knocking over the wooden box, spilling its contents across the floor. The photographs, letters, and journal pages fluttered in the air like haunted confetti. The creature stepped into the flashlight's beam, its skin now a pale, sickly gray, stretched tight over its emaciated form. There was something wrong about it, something unnatural. It wasn't just its appearance, it was the way it was. The way it existed in this room, as though it wasn't meant to be here. "The house demands a price," the creature rasped, its voice scraping against Claire's nerves like fingernails on glass. Claire's pulse quickened. She could feel the weight of the words bearing down on her. What price? She wasn't part of their story. She couldn't be. But the owls had already taken her, hadn't it? She was here. She was part of this now, whether she wanted to be or not. She had to understand. She had to find a way out. The creature took another step, and this time, Claire didn't wait. She bolted for the door, throwing herself against it in a desperate attempt to break free. She twisted the handle, but it wouldn't turn. The door was locked. No, it was worse than locked, it was sealed shut, as if the house itself had decided she would never leave. The whispers surged, a cacophony of voices that clawed at her ears, filling her head with images and sounds that weren't real. "Don't you see? It's too late." Her vision blurred, and the world around her began to twist. The walls stretched, then collapsed, warping like wet paper. Time itself seemed to ripple, and Claire felt the floor shift beneath her feet. She reached out to steady herself, but found nothing to hold on to. Her hand passed right through the wall, her fingers sinking into the cold void beyond. The world around her dissolved into fragments of light and shadow. She opened her eyes to find herself in a new place, a vast, endless hallway of decaying wood and cracked tiles. The air was thick with dust, and the floor was littered with old, discarded furniture. The place was familiar but wrong, as though she had stepped into some strange version of the house, one that existed outside of time and space. There was no sound here, no whispers, just an eerie silence that pressed in from all sides. The only light came from a single flickering bulb at the far end of the hall. Claire's breath came in shallow gasps as she pushed herself to her feet, her head spinning. This place, it felt like a memory. She moved toward the light, her feet dragging with each step. She didn't know why, but she knew she had to follow it. The hallway stretched on forever, the walls closing in behind her as if the house itself were narrowing its grip around her. When she reached the bulb, it flickered one last time and went out, plunging her into darkness. Claire gasped and froze, her heart thumping violently in her chest. She couldn't see anything now, just the crushing weight of the dark pressing in from every side. Then, the whispers returned. "This is the room." It was the same voice, the distorted, hollow sound that had been speaking to her from the cassette recorder, from the walls, from the very air itself. "It starts with the room." Claire turned sharply, a wave of nausea hitting her as the darkness seemed to shift around her. She felt the floor under her feet change, the texture of the ground rough and uneven, like old stone. Her flashlight flickered back to life, and she turned it toward the wall. There, etched into the stone, were the words, "Those who enter the room never leave." A low rumble filled the air, like the distant sound of thunder, but it wasn't coming from outside, it was coming from within the house. Claire could feel the vibrations in the floor beneath her, the walls beginning to tremble. Something was happening. The hallway seemed to stretch further now, endless in its expansion. There were doors on either side, but none of them had handles. She could hear scratching from inside them, something was trying to get out. Claire's breath quickened as she realized she wasn't alone. The house was alive. She reached one of the doors, pulling at it with all her strength, but it wouldn't budge. Behind her, the figure appeared again, its limbs stretching unnaturally long, and its featureless face once more staring at her with its soulless void of eyes. "You can't escape." The whisper was so close, Claire could feel it in her chest, vibrating through her ribs. She turned around and backed away, her pulse racing as the thing stepped closer. But then, something stopped her. The floor beneath her feet gave way, and she fell forward into a dark pit. She landed with a thud, the air knocked from her lungs. She gasped, trying to regain her bearings. When she looked up, she found herself in a new room, smaller, more confined. This was the room. The one that Thomas Whitaker had written about. The walls were lined with hundreds of photographs, faces she recognized from the pictures she'd found earlier. The Whitaker family. But there were others too, dozens of them. People who had come and gone, people who had disappeared into the house without a trace. And in the center of the room, standing motionless, was the thing from her nightmares. It was no longer a shadow. It was no longer a creature. It was a presence, something ancient, something that had always existed within the walls of the house. It was the house itself. Chapter 5, The Final Choice. Claire's breath was ragged as she stood in the center of the room, her legs trembling beneath her. The oppressive darkness clung to her, suffocating her senses, as the presence before her grew more tangible. The walls seemed to pulse, and the photographs surrounding her seemed to move, flickering with an unnatural life. Faces stared at her, their eyes wide with terror. Her stomach turned. The faces of the Whitaker family, along with others she didn't recognize, twisted in agony, frozen in time. The thing in the center of the room, the one that had once been a creature, a shadow, a distorted figure, now loomed as something far worse. It had no body, no form, only the swirling, oppressive void that filled the space around it. It was the house. The very essence of it. Claire's heart pounded in her chest, the intensity of the moment overwhelming her. She backed away from the thing, only to find the walls closing in on her. The space shrank. The room seemed smaller now, like the house was shrinking along with it. She couldn't breathe. She could barely move. "You wanted the truth, Claire," the voice whispered, and the sound of it was like 1,000 nails scraping across the chalkboard of her mind. "You wanted to know why we call this place home." Her mind reeled. The house, it had always been alive, but it wasn't the house itself. It was the people who had come before her. The spirits of those who had been consumed, who had sacrificed themselves, who had been claimed by the thing in the center of the room. The Whitaker family, the missing locals, and countless others, they were all here, part of the house, trapped in an endless loop of torment and despair. They hadn't just vanished. They had been absorbed, turned into part of the house's grotesque tapestry. "And now, you are one of us," the voice hissed. "You are a part of the story now, Claire. The house demands you. The house needs your soul to keep it alive." The walls groaned as if in agreement, the sound reverberating throughout the room, shaking the very foundation beneath her feet. Claire stumbled, falling to her knees, her hands shaking as they scraped against the cold stone floor. Her vision blurred as the weight of the realization crashed over her. She couldn't escape. The house wouldn't let her. The door she had tried to open earlier was gone. The photographs on the walls were now faces, full of horror, their mouths moving soundlessly, as though screaming. The shadows twisted and writhed, growing into grotesque shapes that hovered just beyond her reach. Claire clutched her head, her mind threatening to break. The whispers were too loud now, filling her ears, drowning out her thoughts. There was only one thing left to do, face it. She stood shakily, the room spinning around her. The presence in the center of the room pulsed with energy. Every fiber of her being screamed to run, but her legs wouldn't move. The house was not just a structure, it was a living, breathing entity, and she had unknowingly stepped into its trap. There was no escape. "Do you hear them, Claire?" the voice hissed, growing louder and more insistent. "The ones before you. The ones who failed to make the choice. You will join them. Or you will stay here. Forever." A cold chill swept through the room, and Claire's thoughts faltered. The creature, or the essence of the house, was offering her a choice. A choice she couldn't ignore. She had read it in the journal. She had seen it in the photographs. The Whitaker family had made their choice. But it hadn't been enough. The house demanded a price. And there was only one way to pay it. Claire's breath came out in shallow bursts as the weight of the decision pressed down on her. There was no going back. The house wouldn't let her. She could feel the pulse of it, the dark heart of it, beating in time with her own. She wasn't just a visitor here. She was part of it. Part of its hunger. The house chooses you, the voice whispered, its tone seductive. But you must choose it in return. The thing in the center of the room flickered like a dying flame, and Claire's mind raced. She thought back to the letters, to Thomas Whitaker's journal, to the warnings he had left behind. The price. He had tried to escape, but the owls had devoured him too. Everyone who had entered had been devoured. It wasn't just a haunting. It was a force that consumed. And it wanted her to become part of it. Her body trembled as she reached out a shaking hand, touching the cold stone wall beside her. The house was alive, and it wanted her soul. If she didn't make the right choice, she would join the endless parade of lost souls that haunted these halls. The house will be fed, the voice crooned, growing more urgent. Make the choice, Claire. Join us. You know what you must do. She closed her eyes, the weight of her options suffocating her. The house wanted her to choose to give in and become part of the twisted family of the house, to feed its insatiable hunger. But if she resisted, if she rejected it, she would never leave. She would remain here, trapped forever in the suffocating dark. The house would keep her as a prisoner. A final, horrible realization struck her with the force of a lightning bolt. The house didn't care if she stayed or went. It would never let her leave because it was never about escape. It was about consumption. It wanted to feed on her. It needed her. Claire's breath was ragged, her thoughts fragmented, but there was one thing she knew. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. The whispers had become a chorus of voices now, those who had come before her. The Whitakers, the missing, the lost. They were all there. Their spirits, their suffering, their stories woven into the very fabric of the house. She could feel their presence in every corner, their desperation, their fear. Make the choice. But Claire couldn't give in. She wouldn't. With every ounce of strength left in her, Claire screamed. She screamed at the owls, at the shadows, at the thing that watched her, demanding to consume her. And for a moment, just a moment, everything stilled. The whispers faded. The walls stopped pulsing. The room went completely still. The presence before her seemed to withdraw. Claire opened her eyes and found herself standing alone in the room. The walls were silent. The darkness receded. The house was still. For the first time, she felt free. But it wasn't over. Claire turned toward the door, her heart racing. The whispers had quieted, but the house was still watching. She reached for the doorknob and twisted it, praying for it to open. The door creaked. And then, to her astonishment, it swung open. The outside world was bathed in sunlight. She had made it out. But as she stepped into the light, she felt the cold hand of the house brush against her shoulder, just for a second. And then she heard it. You can never leave. And she knew, deep down, that the owls had not let her go. It was just waiting. Waiting for her to return.